Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Political Forum. Tonight we have three topics as part of our current events forum. The three topics are book bans, Joe Rogan, and the Canadian truckers. Here's the description from our meetup page. It's been a while since we've discussed stories and events unfolding around us. For this meeting, we've selected three of the most compelling topics shaping the public discourse at the moment. The first topic is the so-called book bans. This occurred in Tennessee when a local school board removed the novel Mouse, which is about a Holocaust, from its curriculum due to language and nudity concerns. And as it made that determination, it stirred a national controversy. So let's explore the following points. Is the purported book ban akin to censorship? How do the critical race theory and the educational transparency come into play with the book ban, if any at all? Next, when the parental rights and free speech conflict, whose rights and interests should prevail? And if so, on what basis? Then the next topic is the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. And are the accusations of COVID misinformation aired on the podcast valid and justified? What is your reaction to Spotify's handling of the host's comment on air about race? Did you find either or both formal apologies issued by Rogan recently to be sincere? How do you compare Rogan's incident to that of Whoopi Goldberg, who was recently suspended from The View? And then the final topic is the Canadian truckers, also known as the Freedom Convoy. Here, in light of the recent series of ongoing protests and blockades, although I think the protest pretty much came to an end this week. This was written last week. So at the time of the writing of this event description, the protests were still going on against vaccine mandates and restrictions. With that being said, let's explore the following questions. What are the similarities and differences, if any, to other civil protests and unrests that have taken place in the recent past, most notably the BLM protests, the Yellow Vest protests in France, and the Hong Kong protests? The next question is it improper and intellectually dishonest to compare the Canadian truckers' protests, such as the tactics, the purported grievances, the ideological makeup of the protesters? Is it improper and intellectually dishonest to compare them to other protesters? Is there something unique about the Canadian protesters? The next question is, what is your reaction to the Canadian government's unprecedented response to quash the protesters by invoking the Emergencies Act, which is almost akin to their martial law? Do you believe that the freezing of the financial transactions and accounts and the clampdown by the crowdfunding sites to be warranted and justified? Next, have certain elements of hyperpartisanship in the US spilled over into Canadian politics? Then the next question is, will a similar type of protest by use of trucks to blockade public roads, will that be mimicked in the US? In other words, is what we saw in Canada, is that a dry run for something that could be mimicked here in the States? And if that were to happen here in the US, would you oppose it or support it? And if so, based on what ideological basis? And finally, what are the larger underlying issues behind the protesters, if any at all? So there's plenty to talk about, three topics. So why don't we go right into the first topic, which is the banning of the novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And just by way of introduction, for those of you who have not followed this story, it's a very famous book, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, written sometime in the 70s, I believe. And this would have been just a local story in some obscure county in the state of Tennessee. But ultimately, this garnered a national attention. And I think the timing is also interesting too, because I believe the vote taken by the Board of Education happened the week of the Holocaust Remembrance Day. Now, when I first heard this story. I thought it was maybe people in the Board of Ed were somehow trying to be Holocaust deniers, or they're trying to maybe somehow rewrite certain aspects of history, but that's not the case, at least according to the meeting minutes that's available online. And while I go through the points, I'm just gonna share with you the link to the meeting minutes if you want to take a look. Just hang on one second. I believe it's a PDF file, but you should be able to access it there. So in reading the meeting minutes, which you can follow with me, I think it took place on, it's like the 13th of January, so last month. The opposition to this book, it turns out that it was things like, quote, the use of the Lord's name in vain, and the language and the artwork was not age appropriate. And I think here the vote was to whether if the book should be part of the reading list for 8th graders. So that's always important to keep that in mind. Another member encouraged that in the classrooms, 97% of the materials should have no profanity. And here I think the objection was that there was some, I guess, profanity used, although it wasn't like, like a rated R type of profanity. I think there's a reference to like damn you or damn somebody. And I think that's based on the author's direct conversations or recollection of his family members. Okay. And then there was another person who endorsed the content of the subject, which is the Holocaust, but the language appears to be an issue. So to be fair, I think what the Board of Ed voted on was that the content should be taught in public schools. However, let's try to come up with a more softer, gentler way of teaching this material to the students. Now, interestingly, the author, Art Spiegelman, did have a pretty vociferous opposition to what the Board of Education did. I believe he called it like an Orwellian response, invoking the novel 1984. And another thing that's really interesting is this has been a trend, especially in the last several years. For instance, I was able to look up the American Library Association. According to them, they received just last year about 330 reports of book challenges. So they would have objections to certain books because they thought it was not age appropriate. And it turns out that a lot of these books deal with race issues, teaching LGBT to students. So that's kind of where we are right now. And I think this is an interesting public dialogue to have, because again, where does one parent's right to make certain determinations at a public school, when does that end? And when does the right to not have these books banned continue? So, I mean, that's really the issue. So just overall, are there any reactions to what happened with this Board of Education? Feel free to chime in. You could use your hand raising functions. Let's see, Marty has his hand up, and so does Peter. So why don't we go with Marty and then Peter?
Thank you. Public schools, they're funded by the local citizenry. They have a right to do what they want. I think it's silly. I think it's foolish. I can think of a lot of pejoratives that are applicable, but ultimately it's their freedom to do so. I don't see a case for your second point, Thomas, that there's some kind of right to have these books at the school. No, there is no right as far as I can figure. It's up to the school board and the teachers and the parents to decide, and they voted, and I think they're worse off for it, but that's my opinion. Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks for those comments, Marty. Yeah, I guess it's pretty clear that there's no fundamental right to have access to books. That's not one of the Bill of Rights. However, when parents or other interested parties, whether it's students or maybe members of the school, when they object to these books, when is it ideologically consistent to make certain objections? So, and to me, that's a really kind of blurry line. We don't really have like clear standard. And I'm sure a lot of these standards are very localized. So what's acceptable, let's say, here on the East Coast might not be acceptable on other parts of the country. So, okay, let's go with Peter and then Amber.
Yeah, I was just looking up where this county is, and McMinn County is midway between Chattanooga and Knoxville. It's right in the heart of Appalachia. But I was wondering, why is this even being called a ban? I mean, they're not taking it out of the library. I mean, okay, I mean, I guess we don't know if it's in the library or not, but they're not removing it from anything. They're just saying, we don't think this book is appropriate for the curriculum. We should use a different book instead for the reason they gave. And I was wondering what you were saying, Thomas, about parental rights. Like where are the parental rights here? So I think from the last thing you said, I think what you meant by that was the rights of parents to object to books that are used in the school, and so they go to school. But is that what you meant? Because I'm not sure what you meant when you wrote like parental rights.
Sure. So ultimately, the members of the Board of Education, they are in most jurisdictions, they're elected members. So, you know, the parents who live in that jurisdiction vote for these members to represent the board, and including the president or the chair of the Board of Ed. So I guess, you know, technically it kind of is a representative form of democracy. So,
yeah, it's just it's the voters. It's not parents of school children. It's all the voters in that county.
Yeah, so correct. It's the voters within that local jurisdiction. But if you look at a lot of these meeting minutes, parents are the participants because they have the vested interest. So let's say if you know, parents don't have children that go to that school, they don't really have the vested interest as opposed to, you know, those who do. So I guess one way to look at it, and I think the author might agree with kind of my line of thinking, is that, look, once you start removing these books, it's almost akin to censorship, because just make it available to everybody. And if you have objections to those books, then just don't read it. But I know there is a very fine line. You know, what are the limits? I mean, you know, does that mean we could, you know, have, you know, unrestricted access to the books to be taught for 8th graders? And to me, that's really the question that I'm really wondering. You know, where do we draw that line? Is it based on nudity? Is it based on profanity? Or is it based on ideology? And I think if a concerned parent, you know, in good faith, comes up and says, yes, I don't like the profanity because maybe in certain households they don't use profanity. I get that. But what about ideology or other, you know, what they call certain aspects of critical race theory? That's where it gets very thorny. And I'm curious to see what Amber and Corey has to say. Feel free to add on. So let's go with Amber next.
I agree with Marty. For the most part, I think this happened around the time where we are having discussions of books that are like that are critical race theory or gender identity or anything LGBT. Like those things are actually happening. They're actually being banned. But I think in this instance, I think because of the timing, people just lumped it in with stuff like that. But I don't think that's what this is. I think this Board of Ed decided to just use a different reading material. They're not teaching about the Holocaust. They're just using a different resource, which to me is fine. I read Mouse, I think in high school. It was not required, but it was a part of the additional reading that my teacher had. And I think from what I had heard that they had taken the material out because of nudity, which again, I didn't get because it's mice. It's not people that are naked, it's mice that are naked. But for the most part, I don't think it's a ban. They're not taking it from the school libraries. They're just not using it in this year's curriculum. And I think that's fine. That's well within the rights of the school board to do that. But overall, for if we were talking about the other topics that you brought up, I think that's horrible. I don't think schools are made to protect people's feelings. They're there to educate. And though parents should have a vested interest in their child's education, I'm more of a, because I have two small kids in school right now, I'm more of a like, let them learn whatever at school. And then when they come home, we have a debate, we have a discussion. Like, this is what I believe, and this is what they taught you at school. And so tell me which one makes sense, because I want to raise critical thinkers. I don't want people to just, kids that just grow up and believe whatever line you give them. So I don't mind it personally. But at the same time, for me, when I see a lot of this hubbub around like laws being made in Florida and Texas about taking out specific wording, books and stuff like that, I think that's dangerous. It puts me in the line of thinking of Nazis when they used to burn books or like ban people from reading things. And it usually impacts mostly authors of color or authors that are part of the LGBTQ community. And I just don't think that's smart, especially since we're not doing well in reading. The last thing we want to do is take away books. So for me, this is not the same thing, or it's not on the same level as those instances. This is just a school board deciding that, look, there's too much controversy with this book. We can use other materials, and I think that's fine.
Okay, thanks, Amber. And it's interesting that you had made references to Texas, because it seems like a lot of the controversy really starts in Texas, where the issue is not so much whether if these controversial topics should be taught at all. It's whether if these topics, again, the worst atrocities of humanity within the last, let's say, 2 centuries, whether it's wars, imperialism, genocide, Holocaust, slavery, can those things be taught in a more kind of watered down, I guess, rated G, for lack of a better word? Can it be taught in that manner? Or when a student wants to really think critically, should they really appreciate the harsh realities of what happens in these atrocities? And I think that's really the debate. And when you look at the meeting minutes from the Board of Ed in Tennessee, I think the parents or the members of the board, they did act in good faith and say, look, we just have some concerns about, certain graphic and nudity, those elements. Maybe we should kind of tone it down a little bit. But unfortunately, some of these books, there's no like watered down version of it. So how can you convey that main point by the author without letting the children or the students read the book in its entirety without any kind of editing? That's the question. All right. Let's go to Corey, Margaret, and Andrew. Hey, Corey, you're muted.
Sorry. I was thinking maybe I made a mistake. When I read the topic for this discussion today was about Joe Rogan and the truck convoys in Canada. Was that right?
Yes, you are correct. We have 3 topics today. So we're just starting the first topic, which is regarding the book Mouse. And once we finish that, we're going to go into the next 2 topics, which you just mentioned. So,
okay. So right now you're talking about book censorship. Well, right off the top, there was the thing about, you mentioned about Holocaust. Well, there are different categories. If you're talking about book censorship, I mean, Holocaust is quite a different area than a lot of the things that might be considered. I don't think very many people would say, yeah, allow books that are Holocaust deniers into the school system. I don't think that would get very much support, and we get a lot of criticism right off. So I think there are other ones that are being maybe lumped into that. Like if you're going to ban Holocaust, you you should also ban this other thing, which is much more moderate, or something like that. So I think it's a kind of a case by case. It's a case of, long ago when I was in a school, it was pretty much up to the teacher. Anyway, I remember when I was in high school, the teacher brought in some quite controversial stuff. And as long as it doesn't go on up into being criticized, he got away with it and everything was fine. I don't think it went around. So it's a case of, is it up to the teacher? Then if it's not up to the teacher, is it up to the school? If it's not up to the school, then it goes up to the board, like that. So I think it should go teacher to school to board, like that. But I mean, obviously there are certain things that are too outrageous to be allowed.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Corey. And we will get to the next topics, the next two that you mentioned after this one. But Corey makes a good point, because I think a lot of times it's really based on the local districts, case by case. I think it's also based on region too, because depending on the geography of the school, you're going to get a different response, which is fine. But sometimes what ends up happening is you get this kind of both-sidism. And what I mean by both-sidism, a perfect example is the Civil War. A student, let's say in the Northeast or on the West Coast, might get a different understanding of the American history when it comes to Civil War versus those from the Confederate States, because obviously those who are in the Confederate States view it as the war of Northern aggression. So the narratives are very different, and they emphasize on the lost cause and etc. Whereas in the North, it's taught differently, saying that it was all about based on slavery. So interesting points. All right, let's go to Margaret and Andrew.
Sorry about that. I'm on my phone, so it took me a second to find the button. So, hi, my name is Margaret, and I joined tonight because I'm really curious to hear what other people say. Now, I'm a librarian, so book banning is something that's very close to my heart. We actually celebrate a Banned Books Week in public libraries, which is a little misleading because there's never banned books. It's like somebody else just said. It's about books that are challenged usually. I think the term banned is used like a rallying cry in many ways. That being said, I think when it comes to the schools, a few other people have already said this, but I think it's funded locally. Typically, school boards are governed by the parents, and I think that when the parents have decided collectively that a book should be, not necessarily taught, and they're finding alternative materials, I don't necessarily consider that banning per se. And of course, as someone else just said, it can be very sensitive in terms of topic. But my understanding is, at least where I went to school, I grew up in a very conservative family, and I was actually pulled out of a few of my classes because my parents didn't want me reading the literature. The school is required to teach to offer an alternative text and offer alternative assignments that will also teach the same topic. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at, book challenges individually versus as a whole. In this case, it's as a whole, and I think that it really does boil down to the community has spoken. And I'm sorry, I never catch anybody's names. Somebody else just said this. This was really in a group of people looking for a text that maybe they felt was more appropriate for their audience. And we don't necessarily have all those, all the reasons for that. In my example, my school did have a challenge to a book, and it wasn't so much that parents hated the book, although some parents really hated the book. It was that they were teaching it in the 9th grade versus, say, the 11th grade, which a lot of people felt was more appropriate. And the book did end up getting pulled from the 9th grade curriculum.
Okay, thank you, Margaret, for those comments. It's always good to get some insights from a librarian. And to be fair, in our event title, I did use quotes when I used book ban. I know that's a bit of I guess, misidentification, but it does, like Margaret said, it's a rallying cry, or it certainly conjures up some visceral reactions when people see that, because what I remember reading, when I was reading Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, that's exactly what they did. They were banning books and burning books. So. Okay, Andrew, and then back to Amber. Andrew?
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, so I came in late. So are we just pretty much talking about the reaction to the ban or of the book, or?
Yeah, reaction. And let me ask you this, Andrew. Maybe you could add something further to the conversation. Should there be any restrictions to, let's say, what a 13-year-old student, which is like an 8th grader, should or should not read? Should there, on what standard or on what basis should certain books not be part of the reading list?
Well, with the mouse book, that was mostly talking about things with the Holocaust. So, and from the summary of the mouse book, it's the author's original intentions was that he didn't want the book to be read by a younger audience, but it was actually like youngsters, like people in their teens that were like, hey, this book is pretty cool. Yeah, I really like reading this book, and I read it at the age of 14. And it was actually younger people who actually wanted the book to be out, to be read to people in their age range. So I don't know. I don't like see a big deal in terms of the book being around. I mean, there was only one scene where there was like a naked chick, and that chick was supposed to be a representation of the author's like mother, like committing suicide. So, I mean, back in my day in high school, we had history class, and we read pretty, how should I say, touchy subjects in which it involved the Holocaust. So I don't see what's the difference between mouse and like reading a history book. To be honest, this sounds like it's it's a case of a bunch of Karens and helicopter parents that are just looking to be outraged about. But there has been a movement specifically with like conservatives in which they're being more vocal in school board settings, especially with the CRT stuff. So I'm not really surprised they're going this route. But there is another book that piqued my interest that got banned in many schools, which is an LGBT book, which is called, I believe it's called Not All Boys Aren't Blue. And that book has been banned in like 14 schools. And I am very worried in terms of stuff getting suppressed because, I mean, back in my day in high school, I'll just say the book would have probably been useful for me in terms of figuring out my sexuality. Until, I didn't figure out my sexuality until I was like a senior in high school. But yeah, I think withholding information like that can be very valuable in terms of youngsters nowadays who are trying to figure themselves out and who are really interested in the reading events. So I am not a fan of where this is going. Like someone said, if they have alternative material, which is approved, that'd be great. But to be personally honest, I think these books aren't really too much of a threat, and these are just people who are being over dramatic so they can be riled up over nothing, to be honest.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, for those comments. And I think an interesting point that Andrew brings up is this: should public schools continue to teach sex ed? For those of you who attended public schools, high schools in the US, I'm sure most of you probably sat through at least one class of sex ed. If that's the case, then again, when is it proper to teach kind of more all-inclusive version of sex ed? Does it only have to be one type of relationship, or should it include the LGBT component? And that's highly controversial. And I just don't know what the right answer is. I think Corey might have said it before. It might be based on the locality because, again, certain communities have standards that may or may not be acceptable to youngsters. All right, let's go to Amber and then we'll wrap it up with Marty. Amber?
Something that you said stuck in my head about the watering down of certain topics. I think that I'm already like biased in the sense that I've had both an American education and a non-American education, and I already feel like a lot of American, um, just basically anything is really watered down in the American education system, and it worries me because your kids aren't going to stay in one place forever. They're not going to stay in that small town forever. They're not going to stay in that state forever. They might not even stay in that country forever. And so they tend to get a cultural shock every place that they go because, they don't have the full picture of what it is to be a mature adult. Like you brought up sex ed. I was reading the other day in that I think it's the Netherlands starts teaching sex ed in kindergarten. And then when the kids are like 8 or 12, they actually introduce porn into like the curriculum. And so you have 8-year-olds watching porn. And yet I was like, it blew my mind. And then I went to go look at their national average of when kids become sexually active. It's 17. So even though sex was introduced to them, they didn't go crazy and just hop into it. Once they had the proper education, they knew to do it on their own time and in their own terms. And I bring that up because I think a lot of parents don't give enough of their kids credit enough. And I can't parent everybody else's child. I don't know everyone else's child. So I do tend to lean towards, okay, if the board of ed decides that this should be tweaked, then fine. But I don't really leave it up into the hands of parents because there was a time when parents didn't want their kids to learn next to a Black kid. So I don't think parents all the time know what's best for their child. And I think it should be left up to professionals. So like teachers, like child psychologists, like the board of ed, or hopefully people who are more interested in educating the future, adults of this, world, not just, Joe Blow's, 5-year-old son Timmy. So I do think it's a double-edged sword because really there are a lot of terrible things that have happened in history that we really cannot water down. I mean, that's why we even have the discussion about CRT, is because so many things have been watered down that a lot of times people lack empathy talking to each other and understanding each other. And so we have to come up with new tools on how to teach children how to see outside their little boxes. So watering down education is never a go for me because it doesn't help in the long run. So you keep them innocent for, like however long, and then boom, the world hits them and they don't know what to do or they don't know how to respond. A lot of parents tend to be lazy in terms of teaching their children, or not, lazy. Some of them are actually scared, and I get it. It's scary. There's no real manual on how to be a parent. But I think it should just be left up to the professionals because we don't really know what our kids are capable of as parents because our job is to protect them 24/7. So even from, naked mouse on the naked mouse in a book, I just think we should leave it to professionals.
Okay, thanks, Amber. Looks like we have some more hands up. So Marty, Olga, and then Andrea.
Okay, thanks. So a few things. Let's remember there are other books that have been banned. To Kill a Mockingbird, Huckleberry Finn, books that quote have offensive language in it. This is nothing new. And again, I stick with, the public school being funded by by the local community. They have a right to make those decisions. Now, one point where I might disagree, where parents should have an ultimate say, is with sex education. I think, first of all, you ask at what age should sex education begin? And I think it should begin when children ask questions. Children are always entitled to an answer. And and not some stork answer, but a real answer. So I think sex education should be mandatory in schools along with reading, writing, and arithmetic, despite what the teachers might, despite what the tax-paying citizens say. I think it's really imperative. Now, as to what should be taught with regard to sex education, it has to be age appropriate, of course, and there's a lot, that's a whole other discussion. I want to mention something, bounce a couple of things from what Amber said, that she had American education and non-American education. I remember having a conversation with a Black guy who was saying, your education is not my education. Your history is not my history. So, I'm an American Jew. My family's been living here for 100 years, so I said to him, I had both, as far as I'm concerned, they're both my history. American history is my history. Because I identify as an American. I'm very proud of that. And of course, I identify as a Jew, and I'm proud of that as well. And so, like so many other Jewish kids, I was sent to Hebrew school after regular day school, which, for kids is torture. And it was an additional 6 hours of being in school per week. And but there I learned my Jewish education, and I learned American Jewish history, which was very different than what I learned in school. Well, I shouldn't say very different. It was just a lot more. And I learned more about Henry Ford and his hatred against Jews and his International Jew, which, by the way, I happened to just start reading. It's an excellent book. By excellent book, I mean it's very interesting. Okay, and with regard to something else that Amber said, that parents didn't want their white children sitting next to Black children. And what's come out lately, even Kamala Harris said this when she was running for president, which didn't last long. But when she was running, she said that Black children do better with Black teachers. And, so would that be true for Asian students? Would that be true for Jewish students? That's an argument for segregation. And also with regard to CRT, CRT is an ideology and is teaching, if you're white, you're an oppressor. If you're Black or any other color, you're oppressed. That's not history. That's an ideology. It's different. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to Olga and Andrea.
Hi. It's for me, it's question that even should not be asked. Because if you're a parent, if you think that your kid should read this, okay, give your kid this book. If you think that your kid should watch porn, okay, do it. But unfortunately, in the United States, we always confronted with these campaigns against something, and especially now with the rising of social media and people who can unite for some cause and make it more visible and more loud and but these actually separate us from really important questions. For example, my daughter, I live in New York, and my daughter was in the best school, high school in New York. She should pass exam, and it was like for one spot in the school, there was like 100 kids they compete for going to this school. And she passed this exam. And yes, she was in the best school, but she does not know geography. She just does not know it as I learned it in my school. She does not know anything about geography of Africa, for example, just nothing. And when Sarah Palin said that Africa is a country, it was not surprising for me because in the best school, they did not learn it. So we kind of start to these ideological discussions, and we don't, for some reason, we absolutely don't think what is really important, because this is just literature. Okay, why don't take a book? Why parents don't think what their children should read? So why they don't give them book? Why they don't think about it? Why it should school to do this? It's public school. It's they cannot have all books. Of course, some books should be. Of course, it's some choice of the books. It's for sure. It's like logical. You cannot read everything. So why we even this discuss? Because it's ideological. For some reason, it became that they kind of make some other points. And of course, if you want to some kind of special sex education, why don't read Lolita? Why not? If you think that children should read it, let your children read it. So it's very important, actually, topic in Lolita. It's how young girls could be groomed for having sex with older men. So why not? If you think so, why not? So this sexual education, it's actually, it should not be done only in school. In school, it's particular sexual education. It's more close that scientific point of view. And family, of course, should take part in education. And here, for some reason, people probably they don't have time. We all really stressed and whatever, but still parents should think about it more and do something by themselves. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Olga. Let's go to Andrea and then
Hi, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm not very good at expressing myself, so I will try to say what's on my mind. I grew up in a very conservative environment in the Midwest, and I remember actually taking the sex education class that everybody was just shocked about, and the whole point of the matter is that parents will have differing opinions, and education is the one place where we can provide informed, well, just to inform people without so much of a bias, you know, whether it's religious or political or whatever it may be, or sexual, a sexual bias. When we have sex education in school, it's important, I think, because as one other person said, it should start when kids start asking questions, and you know, it should be age appropriate. But part of the big problem with banning books, with not allowing sex education in school, with having a 21-year, you know, before you can drink alcohol, is it causes a lot of it causes people to engage, kids to engage in areas where they really don't have that information they need. And what I was going to say with the sex education in particular is Michael Moore had come out with a movie where I still remember we were pointing out that the US was #1 in teenage pregnancy. And, you know, it's this kind of thing. It's you have to provide a good controlled environment. Same thing with To Kill a Mockingbird. I can't believe they would ban that book. It's just, it's crazy, because if anything, you need to teach it and then educate the kids on, why this is horrible. You're going to have kids that go home and their parents are going to use that word that, they're banning in the school, in the book, that the schools are banning the book. That's why we need to have schools to regulate and to inform kids. Anyway, that's hopefully my idea was somewhat clear.
Thanks for those comments. And in some ways, I think what Andrea said kind of harkens back to what Amber had brought up about that certain European countries where they have sex ed at an earlier age. And I think there might be some correlation where the adolescents in the US, they engage in binge drinking when they go to college or when they turn 18, I guess. And if you go to other nations, that's really not a thing, because in other nations, they develop a relationship with alcohol at such an early age where there's no like pent up demand where you need to engage in that kind of excessive binge drinking behavior. And I'm wondering maybe if what Andrea had mentioned about the high rates of teen pregnancy in the US is due to this maybe, the timing of when certain things are taught to students. That'll be interesting to correlate those two topics if there's any studies on that. Okay, let's go to Ellen, Margaret, and then Corey. And after that, we do need to move on to the next topic. So, Ellen.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment about the Netherlands. Someone brought up the Netherlands before, and when they start teaching their children sex education. I've been to Amsterdam, and there were definitely things I saw that were not American culture. And I think that does have to be taken into account when it comes to education. For example, I saw people taking their children into a McDonald's, which was right next to a porno shop in a nice area. When I went to a farmer's market, like what we have around the city, there was a vendor selling chocolates, and all the chocolates were in the shape of penises and breasts and vaginas. And I was so stunned that I took a picture of it because I thought it was hysterically funny. And I was trying to think, gee, what would happen if this person set up his chocolate stand in Union Square at the farmer's market? So the Netherlands has a history of being a very tolerant people. And I think a lot of that goes back to their history of being traders. They were traders for centuries and went around the world and did business trading and accepted other cultures. It was a natural outcome of doing business. So my only point is that you really can't look at what other cultures do and think that can work in our culture. And that was my only comment.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. Margaret, and then Corey.
Hi, I feel like everybody said so many good things, but a couple of things have really jumped out. I feel like a lot of people have talked about sort of our education and our social perceptions in the greater, where they fit in the greater world. And this is something that I feel really strongly about. I work with children primarily. I'm a public librarian. I work in a children's department, and I really always push for cross-cultural programming. I'm lucky enough to live in a city that's very diverse. And I've observed this over and over where I see children who are exposed, either in my own life or in my workplace, children who are exposed to other cultures or to other ideas tend to be more open-minded and accepting as they get older, and more just, they're able to, they don't look at things as other so much. They don't other everybody else, right? And I think a lot of what we're talking about tonight falls into that. We talk about book banning, which ultimately I think is, you could distill it down to a misguided attempt to preserve your own culture, right? You have people who, they tend to be more conservative. They tend to be maybe, lean a certain way politically. And they are trying to, quote unquote, protect their ideology by protecting their children from exposure to something that they feel is inappropriate for their child. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just saying that it is. On the opposite side, I see this as, I see this from the other side as well. I see, and some people have referred to CRT as an ideology. I've seen, some, I don't want to say misguided, but some maybe incomplete attempts to explore racial identity in a way that I think also just as much as our curriculum does now, isolates some of our Black and people of color into sort of this box that's designated within the parameters of like American. So the example that I'm thinking of, I went this is going back before the pandemic, I went to an Undoing Racism workshop in my city. And just, I'm not on camera, so you can't see me, but I'm very fair skinned. Like I'm very light, I'm freckled. My father's an immigrant from the Middle East and he is not light, he was not super light skinned. And honestly, I felt very dismissed when I was there, because when I would say like, I understand what you're saying. And I also am showing you, like, I'm trying to explain like the immigrant experience. I'm explaining situations that my father was in that, that happened to him. They were actual situations, some of them violent. And it's sort of like, well, you can't possibly understand because you're a white American. And I was like, there's two problems here. First of all, you're dismissing a huge portion of the population. As time goes on, we're a much more mixed population. So many of the children that I work with are bicultural or biracial. And many of them don't, quote unquote, look a certain way. They don't necessarily even fit into their own cultures. And then beyond that, at the Undoing Racism workshop, they kind of put in a disclaimer when they discussed the politics of like being a Black American. It's like, oh, this is only in America. But at the end of the workshop, I left kind of feeling like, what about all of my kids? At the time I was working with teenagers who were getting ready to go to college, many of them. And I was like, what about these kids who are going to go off to other countries and experience life as an adult? And they've been sort of, I hesitate to use the word, but almost conditioned to think that like racial problems are an American thing. I have many friends from other parts of the world, and colorism and racial strife is a real situation in many, many countries. And I feel like many of these children are being taught like, oh, here in America, we treat you so badly. I'm not saying that that's not true, but we treat it like it's a very unique American problem. And that really concerns me, because I feel like some of these kids are set up to be slapped in the face when they go abroad or, what have you. And so I really like that people have kind of brought up over and over again how other kind of looking at other cultures and bringing that into our curriculum, whatever that is so important. And I think this boils down to really all the issues we've talked about, talked about alcohol exposure. I grew up in a house, as I mentioned before, super conservative, but not with alcohol. I had my first taste of alcohol before I could remember. I was like 3. My parents used to give me a little sip of their beer if we were having pizza. And I never felt the inclination. To sneak alcohol. My parents were super hyper, like protective with me about sex. I was yanked out of every single sex ed class in my district. So I became an adult that had very little sex education, and I was very confused for a long time. But to be fair, my friends who took sex education were just as confused. So I think that there's a lot to be said for, reviewing the material, maybe with parents, or somehow, having the parents be more involved in the sex education. Because I do feel the sex education should be taught in the home myself, but only if the parents are willing to do it. And that was the problem with my parents, right? They were very high and mighty about me not learning it anywhere else, but they also didn't want to address it at home. So I don't know, as I'm sitting here listening to people's ideas, I feel like it's sort of that stereotypical, like the old fogey generation that's like, no, my way is the best. And young people are like, no, we need to change. So maybe what we need to be looking at to sort of help solve these issues. And I know public libraries do this sometimes. And I've heard of school districts doing it. I don't know how widespread it is, but having that youth contingent, so maybe like some of the, like having a youth advisory council in a way that gets together and brings issues to the school board and says, like, these are the topics we need to be addressing. These are the things that we need. And not only giving them that, that honor, but also following through with, having a school board and parents that are willing to give them the respect and the time to address those issues and make sure that, the curriculum is adjusted. Because I do feel like a lot of the topics that our young people are crying out for and many of our parents are fighting against, they are youth-led topics, and historically in this country, it's always been the adults that have the power and the youth that don't have as much of a voice. I think that's why we see our activism, like our activists tend to be like a lot of young people. But maybe we need to kind of switch up that paradigm where young people are getting more of a voice so that they can enable the change that's needed.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. And I just want to go back to this statistic that I mentioned before by the American Library Association, ALA. According to their data, in year 2021, they received 330 reports of book challenges. Out of those 330, only 1% was reported by students, which means the 99%, the overwhelming majority, were reported by either parents or the school officials. All right, last comment on this topic will be Corey, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, well, it's kind of difficult when it's the last comment because I'm not really inviting any other comments if this is the last comment. But yeah, I'll continue just to say basically I disagree about the thing about youth having not enough say. They don't have many ideas. Basically, a big problem if you look at YouTube these days is they don't have ideas. Things are changing very fast and they're just going according to whatever is popular. They have no context for things. So as far as adults having more say and children or young people should have more say, this is exactly what we were saying when I was 20 or 18 years old. Well, adults don't know, and adults eventually ceded to young people. I just don't think that young people know enough to have an intelligent overview on to make policy anyway. Anyway, I was going to say before about the 8 to 12 in the Netherlands or whatever. There's a big difference between 8 years old and 12 years old too. And I was thinking education became inculcation. I know Netherlands is a very different culture, but in the United States, at least, it has become a case of inculcation rather than of education. I was playing some rock. Sometimes you see on the YouTube kids playing rock. They'll have them playing some Led Zeppelin songs or something like that, and they're 8 years old or something like that. It's ridiculous. They do not understand what it is. I've played rock music. I've taught English to young children, like 8 years old, 9 years old, and sometimes play rock music or something, some rock music that I like. It's very interesting to see their reaction. They don't get it at all. They don't understand it because there's a certain sexual element in liking that kind of music, and they haven't reached that point yet. So when people are teaching 8 years old, 9 years old about things, sex education, things that they have not reached yet, they are not educating them about something that they are having an issue with at the time. They are inculcating them in advance while their brains are forming. And that's an insidious thing in my opinion.
Okay, thanks, Corey. Before we move on to the second topic, I just want to do a quick segment called Which Books Would You Like to Ban? Okay, so let's just pretend that we are all members of a local Board of Education. And I'm just going to read you a list of books. If you object to any of these books being taught to 8th graders, I believe that's like age 13 or 14, feel free to chime in. Just very quickly, tell us why, on what basis you would put this on the banned list of books or challenged books. So somebody mentioned Huckleberry Finn. Would anyone object to that being taught to 8th graders? No one? Okay. What about Gone with the Wind? And I think the criticism there is that it has a very kind of rosy view of the Confederacy during the Civil War. All right, here's a controversial one. What about Mein Kampf? Should that be taught to 8th graders? Like read its entirety?
I tried reading it a couple of times many decades ago. It's about 500 or 600 pages. the first 100 pages, he goes into quite a bit of detail about why he hates Jews. And of course, I found that fascinating and not the least bit boring. But I couldn't get beyond that when he starts talking about the history of Germany and everything. It seems kind of convoluted and very boring. But should it be allowed? Yes, I think it should be allowed.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to, just very briefly, because we're running out of time, Lucine and then Amber.
You could argue for it shouldn't be sort of advertised. Like if you're at school, the teacher shouldn't be sort of encouraging you to read it when you're 13, but it should be available.
Okay, thanks. Amber, what do you think?
So Mein Kampf, obviously not, not to in the 8th grader. I read it in college and and it's hard to even understand. And then as for Gone with the Wind for me, I used to be my favorite movie when I was a kid, and it actually made me want to have a plantation wedding. And then I grew up and I realized what a plantation was, and so it's not that I wouldn't teach it to them. I would offer context, because in all honesty, every plantation wasn't a horror show. Not every slave owner was I mean, you're a slave owner, so you're automatically terrible, but they weren't all like torturing and their slaves to that extent. They were more like servants. So I think it's fine to have a different view of the South around that time period, but there should be context that this was in every household, and do not, believe the hype.
Okay, thanks. And Andrew, which book would you like to ban?
I mean, with Mein Kampf, most kids won't even understand the context or would even care about it, because I know definitely when I was age 8, I wasn't interested all that much in school. So I think it's definitely a point where you need to bring in a book that kids, well, not kids, but where obviously, the kids are age appropriate to know like what's going on, and they can like comprehend what's going on. I don't even think, I mean, if kids are interested in reading it, they definitely need like a context or like a teacher to obviously do their job in terms of like going over it and like having discussions about it, especially. But I don't think at the age of 8 kids should be reading Mein Kampf, because I think it's just the context barrier is too high for them to understand what's going on, especially with like other books, like with LGBT books. Like I just said, obviously those books are supposed to be for like kids who are going through their teens, where hormones are flowing and they're going through the changes and they're being independent and all that stuff. So obviously it's age appropriate for kids to be reading books like that.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And just for clarification, I think the age group that we're using now is age like 13, because that's the age group in the McMinn County, Tennessee. All right, I know Kevin and Sam, you guys have your hands up. We will get to you just in a second. I just want to list some more books, because again, the purpose of this exercise is we're kind of testing the limits of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And really, there's no right or wrong answer, but I want to find out why these things are not acceptable to like an 8th grader. All right, what about a book by Ibrahim X. Kendi? It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist. Should that be taught to 8th graders? Along those lines, what about a book from somebody who is more on the alt-right spectrum, like Richard Spencer? Should either of those books be included in the 8th grade curriculum? Let's go to Kevin, Sam, and then back to Lucine. So Kevin?
Yeah, I caught only very little of the last hour I was running around, so I pretty much caught nothing. But just to, I guess, address your question about what would I ban if I could ban something, it's never crossed my mind. I have no wish. I don't stay up at night wanting to ban this or that, or something I don't like or don't agree with or whatnot. So I would say my main issue is the banning itself. Is we often don't hear the other side let's just take Russia, Ukraine. I guess some congressmen today, or I don't know if it was in England or probably here as well, they want to ban RT. What? Why? Let me hear the other side. Why not? How can you? This is like banning someone in during a trial or something. There's two sides to the story. Let me hear the other side. And I can make plenty of other examples here in the States where only one side is heard for decades. But yeah, I'm the opposite. So yeah, that's
okay, so more the merrier. Okay. Sam and then Lucine.
Thanks. So I mean, I have a big problem with the whole debate because I grew up in France, and I have to say our secondary and primary sort of curriculum was outstanding. Sort of you're talking about like whether 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds should read Mein Kampf when they barely know where Germany is. When they're 17. So this is like just kind of like this ideological content is really inappropriate, regardless of whatever ideology it is. Kids should learn how to read, write, and how to like sort of understand math, so they can understand sort of what is a geometric progression, what is like, what are the dynamics in an epidemic, or what does a mortgage do. And they're not really getting this very basic sort of level of education that's going to allow them to think critically and consider sort of like higher sort of ideological content that all these books have, once they have a little bit of more maturity and the tools to think and to really and sort of the perspective, like learn what is Germany or something. That's really more important.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Lucine.
It's more like the scene.
Oh, sorry.
Too much. Yeah, so I think when it comes to ideological books, which I think what you're kind of going at, and like kind of ideological books that are likely to sort of be more propaganda materials than the critically together things. Like I think again, banning them is not really a good idea. But what is a good idea is I think what Sam and Amber earlier mentioned was to make sure that people who are reading it have critical thinking skills that kind of decide for themselves what they think. So the focus I think should be more on increasing how critically people can think when they're in 8th grade than like policing what they can and cannot read.
Okay, thanks. We just have some more books on this proposed ban list. What about Handmaid's Tale? Would anyone object to that? Or Harry Potter? Okay. What about this one? Here's it looks like Ellen might want to weigh in on either of those books. Yes, Ellen?
I think some of these books, I don't know if they would be appropriate for an 8th grader. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale, I did not read it, but I watched the series on Hulu and I discussed it with my friend who's read all the Margaret Atwood books. And I just don't think that's appropriate for somebody in 8th grade, maybe somebody who's older and could maybe relate some of what's discussed in that book to things that have really happened to women in like the Taliban society. But I just think at certain ages, children don't have enough, well, I don't know what you call it. You're just not mature enough to read certain types of books yet, which doesn't mean they should be banned. They just should be perhaps offered at a different age.
Okay. Andrew.
Thomas, did you say Harry Potter is up there too?
Well, I mean, it did stir up some controversy because, they talk about wizardry, witchcraft, and, you have certain religious groups who are opposed to that. So, but again, that is based on certain locality. I know, Amber, you have your hand up. I just have some other books I want to list off, and then we'll move on to the next topic. What about this one? The Bell Curve by Charles Murray. And the controversy there is that there's a chapter dedicated to equating intelligence with race, which is a highly controversial topic. Should something like that be taught to youngsters in public schools?
Yes, I read it when it was published. I read a few of his books. First of all, let me make real clear what Charles Murray, Jordan Peterson, other people that fall in that category, they all say very clearly, without a doubt, there are millions of Blacks smarter than millions of Asians, smarter than millions of whites. It's just the bell curve is shaped differently, and it's not as positive. That's all.
Okay, thanks. Amber and then Andrew, just real quick, you guys can weigh in on any of these points.
I'd like to say just overall, what I would do is create a critical thinking class for 8th graders, just across the board. Bring every controversial book that you've listed, any controversial book, put it in this class and have a teacher have a debate. Because if you start banning books, this country is not built on, censorship. It's built on freedom of speech. So if you start banning books, you are going to start silencing the discourse that's necessary to happen to make a cohesive society. So I think if there's a controversial book out there or a controversial theory out there, I would rather it be taught in schools than be not taught really in schools, but really talked about in schools, rather than it be on social media with a bunch of people who have no education and have ulterior motives and aren't there to educate people, just to mess people up. So I rather all these books be in school, fine. All of them be in school, but they have to be a part of like a critical thinking course, and we have to have kids debate it out, talk it out, and come to their own conclusions. I'd rather that than just leave it up to chance at this point, because it's really, it makes no sense. If we're the country of freedom of speech and we're here banning books, it's not a good look. It really isn't.
It's not too often I agree with Amber, so I want to take this opportunity to say congrats, good idea.
High five.
All right. Back to Andrew. What do you think?
Yeah, a major, I would definitely not approve in terms of the bell curve, because the bell curve is full of misinformation and it's not even properly peer reviewed. So I wouldn't approve in terms of, giving kids misinformation in terms of the bell curve book. Yeah, I wouldn't be in approval of giving misinformation.
Okay. The next one is a book by Salman Rushdie called The Satanic Verses. Fair reading material for public school students? What do you think? I think if we were members of the Board of Ed in Iran, I would say.
Not in Iran, I was about to say, not in
I
Iran,
think,
right.
I think like death threats for that book. All right, here's a trick question. What about the Old Testament? Should that be part of the reading curriculum for public school? It's a trick question, but it's well worthwhile question to think about.
Well, it shouldn't be mandatory, but certainly, it shouldn't be taken out, eliminated. It should be optional. If a certain community is religiously oriented, whether Christian evangelist, Jewish, whatever, and they want it taught, why not? Yeah.
Well,
Sure.
it's a theology book. I mean, it's not. That's the problem. Like, it's not. The same with the bell curve. Regardless of its merit or their lack of, it's a freshman sociology class. Okay, it's not a high school book. There's so much more, so much better. Like literature, American literature, European literature, world literature. There's so much content there that you don't really have to go to those sort of things that are like really not part of a basic high school education, like a sort of a basic education. Sort of you have to learn how to read, how to understand ideas, and to write, and you don't really have to go to really sort of thorny subjects that are discussed in college campuses or in forums like this one here. What's wrong with Mark Twain, Balzac? I don't know. There's so much out there.
Okay, thanks, Sam. The reason why I said it's a trick question is because whether if it's the Old Testament or the New Testament or any kind of religious book, it will not pass the constitutional muster because we do have the Establishment Clause, which says there is no state-sponsored religion. So if this were to happen in a public school, it'll be akin to almost like having a school prayer in a public school setting, and that's been ruled down time and time again by the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that it violates the Establishment Clause. So that's why it was a trick question, but very interesting points. I know Andrew, Margaret, Corey, Martin, you guys have your hands up, but I do want to move on to the next topic, which is Joe Rogan. Maybe there's a way for you guys to kind of segue this into the next topic. There is some overlap, I guess. So I will tee up the Rogan topic in this
I
manner.
said something that wasn't true.
Guys, yeah. Feel free to just briefly.
No, I
respond to
mean,
that.
when I was in high school, we read the New Testament as literature, and this was in public school, New York City public schools. It was an English class, and we read it as a piece of literature like any other literature. And the teacher said right on the first day, if you're a fundamentalist, you might feel uncomfortable with the class, and it was done for years. This was in the 1970s, though, but I never heard of it being challenged if it's taught as literature. If it's taught as religion, if it's taught as religion, no, but it could be a piece of literature on the library shelf.
No, that's a good point, Martin. Usually, a lot of these cases that get challenged in the Supreme Court would be if it appears to be a state-sponsored or state endorsement of a particular denomination, then it'll get struck down. But if it was taught in the context of a literature class, I think they might be able to do that and get away with it. But if this were, let's say, like, intro to religion, and the only thing they taught was that particular denomination, I think there's going to be some rumblings in the Supreme Court. Okay, I do want to move on to the next topic, which is Joe Rogan. I don't know if anyone here subscribes to his podcast on Spotify, but really there's two things going on with this podcast that has stirred up so much controversy. One is, I guess, his comments about the COVID vaccine, and he had two, I guess, very high profile episodes, Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Peter McCullough, who are a bit of a contrarian in the medical community. And they had some very, I guess, heterodox views on COVID vaccine. And that stirred up a lot of controversy. And then the other one was they put together this montage of him basically saying the N-word over and over again in this montage. So he ended up giving like a back-to-back apology with like a 2-week period. And you're probably wondering, well, why is Joe Rogan even part of this public discourse that we're having in this group? Well, I mean, he does have a pretty big audience. It's about 11 million subscribers. So I think it is a pretty big deal. And I think he does have a lot of influence in terms of how the public debate is being shaped. So does anyone have any reaction to what's been going on with this podcast? So let's go with Corey, back to Martin, and then Ellen.
Well, so I'm sorry, Thomas, I left my hand up for the previous discussion. Well, I'm interested in the Joe Rogan thing, but I don't have an immediate comment about that. My comment about the last topic is in the chat from before, that it's just that kids are too young to be able to read this stuff anyway. So the teachers just propagandize. That was my point.
And if Ellen is not there, let's go to Peter.
Did you call on me?
Yeah, yes, either Ellen or Peter, but good, Ellen.
Oh, is that
Oh,
me?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I just didn't hear you.
That's okay.
Okay. My feeling about the Joe Rogan thing, and no, I don't listen to his podcast. I know he's very successful and all, but I did listen to his 3-hour interview with Dr. Malone, and it was a very intellectual conversation. I thought that Neil Diamond was totally out of line, making a fadoo that Joe Rogan should be banned from Spotify. I mean,
Excuse me, I think you mean Neil Young.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Neil Young. Thank you. I thought he was totally out of line. I mean, who died and made him God? And then decided to bring on all these other people beating up on Joe Rogan. This interview he had with Dr. Malone, who created many patents that were used in the mRNA vaccine. I mean, what people are really against is this one size fits all, one narrative. And if you don't go along with it, there's been a lot of censorship related to the vaccines. There's definitely been censorship. You're being told you're given misinformation. Well, we have some very highly qualified doctors and vaccinologists and virologists, and they have different opinions. I think it's entirely inappropriate to shut them down. I think it was entirely inappropriate of Neil Young to start this fight and then bring other rock stars in it. And then this whole thing with him saying the N-word, the sense that I got was that a certain side of the political aisle decided to beat up on Joe Rogan and was digging up stuff from years ago without giving us the context. In what context was he saying the N-word? I don't even know what the conversation was. Who was he interviewing? Why did this come up? I mean, Joe Rogan was a Bernie supporter. So why are we beating up on this guy and trying to get a corporation to boot him off? And this is just the whole continuation of this censorship. Shut up. If you don't agree with the narrative, you're getting deplatformed. We're shutting you down. You're not allowed to have a different opinion. It's misinformation. You're a racist. It's this whole thing that's been going on now for over a year. And I can tell you, a lot of people are fed up with this, really fed up. And I really wish Joe Rogan had not apologized so much. He should have done a better job of standing up for himself.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. So as I mentioned, there are two different, I guess, controversies. One being these the guest that he brought on the topic of COVID vaccine, and then the other one is his comment on race. So I think what I've been hearing regarding the guests for the COVID vaccine is that they wanted him to have some kind of like a disclaimer saying that, look, COVID is a very complex medical issue, and there's many different sides to this topic. Even on the topic of vaccines, there's many competing views. Right? At least that's what they wanted to have a disclaimer about, rather than saying that what these two guests, those two doctors, McCullough and Malone, were saying, this is like the most authoritative source medically. And I think because of this reach of 11 million subscribers, they thought maybe he might have some kind of almost like an obligation, like an ethical obligation, as if he is some sort of a journalist, telling the audience, this is what you need to know, but there's other competing narratives. I don't know if you subscribe to that explanation or not, but I do want to hear from, let's see, Peter, Roman, and then Andrew.
Yeah, you mentioned you wrote Rogan's on-air comments about race. I'm not sure what you're talking about there. I mean, there was that video that somebody put together of Joe Rogan's appearances over many, many years using a racial slur. Is that what you meant? I mean, calling that comments about race is not really a good characterization of that.
Sure, I could respond to that, Peter. Yeah, there was like that montage, and yes, he did make comments, and I think there was also a comment about what I meant by comments on race was something about the Planet of the Apes, where he, was doing some kind of like a stand-up, comedy routine, and that got brought up, and that was controversial. So again, when you look at all things in totality, is that unacceptable, or is that something that should be kind of tolerated in a free-flowing conversation format?
But when did he make those comments about Planet of the Apes? Was that recent, or was that some years ago as part of this collection that somebody put together?
I don't know the answer to that.
Many
I'm
years
guessing
ago.
it's over a span of many years, but I don't know exactly when. Anyway, it's just here's really, I think, the core issue regarding what he said is that Are there any exceptions when a person could say the N-word in a public setting? Or is that such a taboo that no one should even utter that word? Is that word, does it have like such a magical, properties where it should not even, be uttered at all? And that's really the issue. And I don't know, Peter, if you have views on one way or the other.
Well, okay. I mean, I think this montage was put together by people who already didn't like him. I was in a debate about this last week, and most of us thought, well, this seems like it's censoring Joe Rogan. I mean, if he can't be on Spotify, then they sort of dominate the market, so he can't really be anywhere else. But then after that, I heard from others pointing out that Spotify is paying Joe Rogan millions of dollars to be on Spotify. So kicking him off Spotify, it's not the same thing as kicking somebody off YouTube. It's like somebody's running a newspaper column in a newspaper. We wouldn't object if the newspaper just decided to drop that column. The columnist can write somewhere else. So don't forget that Joe Rogan was getting many millions of dollars from Spotify, and the decision is about whether to continue that.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. In fact, I think it was like $100 million contract that he signed with Spotify to have his content be exclusively available on Spotify. And really the question, because I use Spotify for music, and the question is, it seems like the app is now kind of transforming more into like a media app instead of just music app. So if that's the case, then do we need to hold Spotify at a higher standard as we would to, let's say, Facebook News or other media platforms? I don't know what the answer is, but Spotify would certainly say we're just a platform that allows different, music and artists and commentators. Okay, let's go to Roman and then Andrew.
Yes, but thanks, Thomas. I looked into this interview that Joe Rogan had with Dr. Robert Malone and also with Dr. McCullough. New York Times and Daily Mail, they did some good fact checking. So it looks like indeed there was some misleading information that was in Dr. Malone's interview. Something could be considered as misinformation, and probably even more of that in interview with Dr. McCullough. Looking farther in Robert Malone's interview, he actually, I think, brought some of the interesting information. At least it was interesting for me to learn and some people in my circle. So he basically mentioned about coordinated efforts to silence anybody who has any opinion outside of the mainstream on the vaccine, and what's called the BBC Trusted News Initiative. He mentioned the case with the girl in the Pfizer study that ended up in a wheelchair after getting a vaccine. Pfizer disputes that, but girl's mother says that's exactly what happened. So, okay, I would like to know that. We don't know, we cannot be 100% certain what happened there, but I would like to know that fact. And he also mentioned basically a story where a regional director for the research company was she was like a whistleblower. She mentioned that Pfizer, played with some like phase 3 trial data. Okay, Pfizer disputed it, but that researcher, still stands on her ground. So again, I think it's good to know, possibly that took place. It's just a few things that I think it's good to know, and I think we just have to be tolerant to minority opinion, that we shouldn't we shouldn't ban Joe Rogan. Probably it's good to put a disclaimer next to those interviews that they may contain some information which is misleading. But I think it should be up to the listener, to the viewer, to decide on what to do. Yeah, I wish there would be more platforms like that, where people with a minority opinion, they would be allowed to basically discuss, issues like this. Yeah, I think Joe Rogan's apologies were sincere. He said that he shouldn't have used that N-word. Just white person shouldn't use it. Although there was no context presented in that YouTube video. He did say that he should do more research for his interviews related to medical information, and that he should invite people from the other side. Yeah, I don't think we can draw, parallels to what Whoopi Goldberg said. I think Whoopi Goldberg, she can say stupid things time to time, and yeah, I just don't see. I cannot just draw a direct comparison here.
Okay, thanks, Roman. One thing I've noticed is that you mentioned, some of the things that were mentioned in the podcast are good to know. But the question is, when does good to know, when does that end? And when does having certain medical recommendations begin? Because if you go back to both episodes of those two doctors, they do talk about ivermectin, saying that how the efficacy of that as like an alternative to the vaccine. And again, we could have a whole nother debate on that later, which I'm certainly not medically qualified to do. But someone listening to that might say, well, maybe I should give that a try. And that's a very kind of, fine line, because, when does, one take that under advisement? And, this is supposed to be just like a conversation, but then someone listening to it might take that as a medical advice. Very interesting point, though. All right, let's go to Andrew, Margaret, and back to Corey.
All right. So, I listen to Joe Rogan stuff now and then, but I usually just hear about him. I'm not a fan of Joe Rogan because he sounds a little bit too dude bro for me. But I think I'm not going to talk about the whole N-word stuff too, because I didn't get a lot of information on that. But there is like one worrying thing I have with Joe Rogan, and I see like a whole avalanche of people usually do this online. It's like this epidemic of like misinformation. This situation with Joe Rogan and like are the vaccines really doing their job and all this stuff, and the questioning of the vaccine. This isn't like Joe Rogan's first rodeo. This has been like his third time doing this stuff. First, it's with the horse dewormer, and then I think another time he was talking about how he was taking this like some kind of treatment in which it was supposed to be only used on people who really can't get the vaccine because their bodies are like super reactive to the vaccine. And it's pretty much only available for people that have a lot of money. I forgot the process of it, but it's pretty much like an antibody related scheme. He was asking or provoking people to do and saying, hey man, you don't have to take the vaccine, stuff like that. So my main issue is like the misinformation, because if you like, Joe Rogan has a very, very big audience, right? And Joe Rogan doesn't ask, how should I say, not a lot of he doesn't have like a critical stance he stays on. And he just like goes with it without like questioning or really giving like critical critical questions to the person on his show. And it leads to the standpoint with the whole vaccine situation where people are still not taking the vaccine because people like Joe Rogan or Tucker Carlson are constantly questioning the vaccines, all in terms to own the libs. And I think there should be, of course, accountability to what Joe Rogan says because he has a very big platform. It's even bigger than like most of the news media outlets we have. So of course there should be accountability for Joe Rogan in terms of his action with spreading misinformation and the vaccine stuff, because there's a lot of people listening to him and they're going to take that seriously, unfortunately. Yeah,
So that's an interesting
leave it for now.
Yeah, so that's an interesting notion, Andrew, because you mentioned accountability. So does that mean the larger the audience he has, there has to be some accountability about the accuracy of the information? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
okay, so let's say if his podcast, just here's like a hypothetical question, only attracted, I don't know, 100 subscribers, fairly small. You wouldn't hold the accountability standard as much because of the reach that he has? Is that what it is?
Not as much, but with how big of an audience Joe Rogan has, yes, absolutely, I would hold them accountable. He needs to be aware of like what he's saying, and there's a lot of people that listen to him, unfortunately, and they will like do what he says, unfortunately. So that's the main issue I have with Joe Rogan.
Okay, I think in defense of Rogan, what he would say is, look, what we do on this program is, 3 to 4 hours of unedited, just conversation. It could be about anything, and let's just see where it goes. And a lot of times, you see him kind of just like think on a spot, or he'll just throw a hypothetical question out there, or just there's like that spontaneous element. There's a famous episode where Elon Musk was the guest, and he just rolled up a joint marijuana, and they were smoking it. And it's like a spontaneous moments like that, I think that really goes viral and has like an appeal for certain folks. So I think if we were to then apply the journalistic standard, it might kind of get in the way of having this kind of unvarnished, free flowing back and forth. And look, to be fair, he does have like a real time fact checker. His assistant Jamie does fact check.
Yeah, but people keep associating Joe Rogan as if he's just like, yeah, he's his own man, and he doesn't follow he's just going with the flow. Of course Joe Rogan has a specific set of political leanings he wants to go towards. So I don't want to give Joe Rogan the award of being like a centrist. I mean, if you're if you're going to stand on an issue, just stand on the issue. Don't be wishy-washy with it. And he does that a lot.
Okay, understood. All right, let's go to Margaret and Corey.
So I'm not going to lie, this is the reason why I joined tonight. I wanted to hear more about other people's opinion on this because I'm not super well informed. I know a little bit, obviously. And I have to say, I really loved what Ellen said at the beginning. I really feel like Joe Rogan, especially since his interview with Sanjay Gupta a few months back, certain people in the media have really been gunning for him because, quite frankly, I think because I saw part of that interview and he didn't seem to capitulate to what Gupta was trying to push. And my question to people who are saying that Joe Rogan should be held to some sort of different standard than other podcasters, whether because of his audience or the type of content he does. I mean, podcasts are not usually news. I'm a voracious podcast listener. I listen to quite a variety of podcasts, and I don't go to podcasts for the news. I know what I'm getting into when I listen. So I think you have to give credit to the listeners in terms of, people who are going to listen are either going to be listening kind of with an ear toward a fight, like they disagree and they just want to hear what this moron and his guests are saying, or they want to be informed about alternative opinions. I don't think that Joe Rogan or any podcaster necessarily has a greater accountability toward the facts. There's a great podcast I listen to out of Toronto It's a conspiracy / paranormal podcast, and I'm very interested in paranormal. And that host says right up front, he's like, I don't believe everything that comes on my show, but I really believe that everybody deserves an open forum. So he has everybody. He has like hardcore, like religious people who do exorcisms. He has total skeptics. He has people who believe in demonology. He has people who practice the occult. He has people from all walks of life within that sort of realm come in and talk about their topics. And he asks questions sometimes, but mostly he's a forum to listen. And I kind of feel like it sounds to me that Rogan, although he engages, I feel like that's kind of the same tenor. He just brings different opinions. And I would argue, would you be arguing that he needs to have a higher standard if he had people who were so-called, authorities on the topic coming in and talking about, how you should get vaccinated? I mean, quite frankly, we do not have the long-term results of these vaccines. We just don't have them. If you look at the fine print on the FDA approvals, they're still waiting until 2025 and 2027 to collect the results on pregnant women and on myocardial impact. So I think people who are questioning the vaccine have a very real reason to do so. It's a new vaccine. It was pushed into the public really quickly, and I think we're right to question. And I think that that's what people are complaining about the most, because he does have a big platform, and he is the one who's bringing this to the attention of sort of the populace at large. I mean, years ago, I worked in a pharmacy, and you'd be surprised how many people would take medication, and I literally had an argument with a man who didn't know what he needed for a refill because he quote unquote wasn't a doctor. He was taking a medication. He had no idea why he was being prescribed it. We've had people who take medications. We've seen this before. In fact, it happened to me where I had a medication that was fully FDA approved, and then it was yanked for being ineffective and unsafe. So I think that people have good reason to question medical authority. And I think right now, Ellen spoke about this, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I feel like Joe Rogan has really been kind of slapped up both sides of his face for this. But we should be questioning, and people don't want to hear the questions. People want to, ultimately people are afraid, and they want to hear that everything's going to be all right. And having a vaccine makes people feel like that. But we even see with the fact that we need to get boosted so frequently that this vaccine isn't all that was cracked up to be at the beginning. So I really feel like this is where all the controversy about Rogan is coming from. Like I said, I think Ellen really hit the nail on the head when she said that essentially people want sanctions against Rogan, and I really don't think that's fair, both as a show, as a person, and as a podcaster. People get into podcasting because they can find a niche that, to talk about their passions or what have you. If you're going to be requiring every podcaster to basically be, some held to the standards of the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, whatever news media outlet you use, then it no longer becomes a podcast. They become reporters, and that's not really what podcasting was meant to be.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. And I know there's a lot of criticisms in the public regarding Rogan's guests or selection of guests regarding the pandemic and the COVID vaccination. But if you go back to March of 2020, at the start of the pandemic, he had Michael Osterholm, who's a very renowned epidemiologist. He came on the show, and they're talking about, will there be a vaccine? And Rogan was singing a whole different tune back then. He was praising how vaccine is one of the major scientific, accomplishments in humanity. So he was almost like championing the whole medical technology behind vaccines. And then now we fast forward a year and a half later, where when he was infected with COVID, he shot a video telling people that he's not, he did not get the vaccine, and he's going to go through some very rigorous alternative therapy using monoclonal antibodies, zinc, some other medications. So the point is this, based on looking at a lot of these episodes from the Rogan podcast, a lot of these topics are not necessarily political, because if you look at the breakdown, I think 1/3 of his podcasts are usually like mixed martial arts guests, because he's obviously pretty big in that world. So MMA guests probably consist of like 25% to about 30% of the guests, and then I would say half the guests are usually comedians, and they just go on the show, they crack jokes, they drink whiskey. It's kind of like good old fun. And then the remaining 20 to 25%, I think he tends to bring on guests that are somewhat, I guess, political. But I think these days, everything is political because of social media. And so if you were to ask Rogan, he would say that he brings on guests who he finds interesting. His main objective, I don't think he really has like an ideology. I think he wants to just have interesting guests so they could have 3 to 4 hours of just uninterrupted conversations. And I think that's what he's really going for. So the other thing I noticed about Rogan is that he's usually influenced by the last person that he spoke to or the people that he surrounds himself with. Like, for instance, somebody mentioned that he endorsed Bernie. I'm not sure if he endorsed Bernie, but he had him on as a guest one time, and they're going through all the policies that Bernie was championing. And the Rogan was basically saying, oh yeah, I could go along with that. Oh yeah, universal, healthcare, social safety net. So it really depends on who he surrounds himself with. Now, unfortunately, sometimes he tends to surround himself with the likes of like Alex Jones. And for some of you, that might be problematic. And I know Alex Jones has been on the show several times. So, but I don't think he really, makes the choice of guests based on whether other people will be offended. He just wants to have interesting conversations. So, okay, let's go to Corey, Amber, and then Lisa.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Rogan goes all over the place on his show. And basically, he tries to get along with the person on the show. He doesn't get into fighting things with the person, you'll notice. Very, very rarely does he do that. But a couple of things, a couple of things that really annoy me. This buzzword, misinformation. Everybody talking about misinformation. Listen, you don't know what's misinformation. You just don't know. You have no right to say what is misinformation. It's just a buzz term. The other one was a conspiracy theorist. Now conspiracy theorist is a demonized term. You don't know what basis there is for conspiracy at all. Actually, conspiracy theories used to mean you were kind of clever. 20 years ago, it used to be a clever thing, or, about JFK and 9/11, all of that was, somebody was being clever. It's only in the last few years, very, very suspiciously, are we being told that conspiracy theorist is a nut. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another thing is, going back to the thing about tying up Joe Rogan getting tied with the N-word thing, the person who put that together very quickly came up with that only because of the COVID issue. Otherwise, that would never have come up. So that, to me, just indicates, again, the tremendous cultural divide that we have going on here. So the person who is, bringing up the N-word thing and strung all of those isolated little bits together, taken out of context to demonize him on that, they're very likely going to be the people who are pro-lockdown, pro-mask, anti-people who have questions about the vax. They're on one side, and there's other people on the other side. It's a big culture war, and that really pathetically illustrates that. So I think people should think about that.
Okay, thanks, Corey. Let's go to Amber and then Lisa.
I'm probably going to be mean at this point, but I just can't play these word gymnastics right now. I think the dumbing down of America is something that intellectuals like people like us that are around here who do our research, do read, are educated, are interested in varying topics. We contribute when we don't call a spade a spade. So I have watched at least 2 or 3 of the clips that were in that mashup of Rogan saying the N-word and the Planet of the Apes comment when he was talking about getting off a bus in Philadelphia and saying he was in Africa and was Black to Planet of the Apes. I don't know what context you need for that statement, but even if you are repeating something someone else said, And which is what happened in the other two clips. There was someone who was very vehemently into using the N-word, and he was just repeating what the guy said. If you know better, you don't do it. I don't use the N-word. And so no matter what conversation I am having, whether or not someone uses it or it tells me to read it I don't use it. And I don't understand what is so hard to understand about not using the N-word. And I don't understand what is this love affair with wanting to use it, because it boggles the mind that if I had gone around calling every man a rapist, we would all understand you can't use that word. There's a negative connotation with rapist. It has a negative history. You can't use that word. This word can only be used for people who have actually committed rape. So what is hard with a group of people saying this word culturally has this meaning to this group of people and would prefer no one else use it? I don't get what's so hard. So that's one. Two, Rogan is a comedian. And so he gets away with a lot of stuff. And I think this is why people like him, is because he has this laid back attitude. He's not one way or the other, although he says he's a left-leaning libertarian. He doesn't feel one way or other. He's a guy that you want to sit down and have a beer with and discuss make all these topics simpler for everyday people. And it's cute. I get it. I get why people will feel comfortable with him. But we really need to get out of this era of keep it simple, stupid. These are not simple issues. These are not simple topics. And when you trust someone like a comedian to inform you about real world, changing issues, there's a problem. And we can all sit here and say, oh, well, people aren't doing that. We have to give people the benefit of the doubt. People can do their own research. No, we are those people who do our own research. We are the people who go, and look at every side of an argument. That is not everyone. We are not the majority. We are the minority. And by assuming that this is happening and that anyone who does like a show should be given all the leeway in the world because, everyone should be a responsible adult, that is not true. It isn't. It's unfortunate. It's unfair. I get that, hey, anybody else with a smaller platform can say whatever they want. He should be able to. No, because you have that platform. Just like we can't have the president of the United States say whatever he wants or say what he really thinks, because even though he's only representing 5% of the population, his words have meaning because of who he is. So if you get that many followers, you also have that same standard that you need to be held to, because we don't live in a world where everyone is doing their own research. And so we just need to stop.
Yeah. Amber, here's a question. Does one group of people have a license to use the N-word and others don't? Or no one should use it at all? What do you think?
If someone says, I don't want you to use this word, whether it's the N-word, whether they want to be known by he or she pronouns, it is just common decency, just human decency to take them at their word and do as they ask. Because I don't see what you benefit from saying the N-word. What's the benefit? I don't why do you want to say it so badly? Is it just because one people can say it and the other person can't say it? There are a lot of words, there are a lot of definitions of different things that we understand we can't use willy-nilly.
Excuse me, should rappers use the word?
I don't know what I said that did not sound like that. If rappers use the word in their music, they can do so. If you are told, whether you're white, black, Spanish, Hispanic, or that you can't use this word, it is only common decency for you to not use the word when asked not to use the word. There should not be a debate about it.
But Thomas asked a question. I don't think you really answered it.
I did.
That's a whole other debate.
I did not answer the question?
I get the spirit of what Amber is trying to say, is that there is kind of like this duty of courtesy owed to others. And something that's so shockingly offensive should not be just invoked willy-nilly. Okay.
I mean, there's
That's it.
history behind it. It's not like it's a
Sure.
regular word. There is history that was created with negative connotation. So I don't see what the need necessary. I don't even use it as a Black person. I really wish Black people would stop using it, but
Okay.
that is their right to do so because it was a word that was directed at them. And if they want to take it back, just like the B word was taken back by women, just like whore was taken back by women, it's all the same. If someone says, I want to use this word and you can't use it, it's not the end of the world. You're not going to die.
All right, thanks, Amber. We do need to move on to some other members here, and then we have one other topic left. So let's try to make this very brief if we can. Lisa, Andrea, and then Mario.
Hi. So this is a little bit, it's a little difficult for me because I see kind of both sides of this issue, and I kind of have things on both sides that I agree with. I see that people were trying a little bit to um I don't know, at least in my opinion, they seem to kind of want to nail Amber for the whole should anyone say the N-word thing. And I'm gonna speak for myself. No one should use the N-word. Not rappers, not Black people, not white people, not Spanish people, not people who think they're aligned with Black people. No one. Ever, ever, ever. It's a horrible word. It should not be used. I'm somebody who used to listen to Joe Rogan a lot, actually. And one of the things that I liked listening to him about was the fact that he was someone who could talk to pretty much, at least from my perspective, anybody. He kind of found a way to find an inroad. It wasn't a confrontational, he didn't have confrontational interviews. He kind of had interviews with people where he just talked to them about wherever they were is where he went. And I appreciated the openness to dialogue and the conversation. I do feel though that a lot of what Amber says, I completely agree with. I think that we have a pride of being as intellectual as possible in this country. And there's a very big difference between differences of opinion and information versus falsities and lies. And we blur that line because a lot of people would prefer even misinformation coming to them if it aligns with what they already thought. A lot of people are much more comfortable with someone telling them something that's not true if it aligns with their political, ideological, or whatever opinion. And that's, I think, why the country gets as divided as it gets, because people get nailed in to that particular stance. I think ideas about the vaccine is very controversial, it's very complicated. I 100% agree that there's a lot that's unknown about this vaccine. It was marketed as take this vaccine and you won't get COVID, which is proven to not be true. It is also 100% true that a lot of the drugs that right-wing media is pushing, you should take this instead, it's been proven to not be effective. Many right-wing people prefer to keep hearing that though, because anything anti-left must be the right thing to do, and it's bananas and bonkers. And I think that with Rogan, India Irie is the woman who presented her point of view about, or not point of view, presented the idea that she doesn't want to be on Spotify, in part because here's a montage of him saying the N-word. Now, from my experience, or just from my memory, a lot of those times when he was saying the N-word specifically was he said the N-word, she said the N-word, he called her the N-word. So it wasn't really him saying the N-word, it was him quoting people. I also do agree that he knew what he was doing. He was being provocative because you can't say it. So he was doing what you can't say. And he knew that at his audience at the time, which was back around 2011, he knew that the people that were mostly listening to him then would appreciate the fact that he's actually saying the boogie word. So he knew what he was doing, but at the same time, I don't hold in the same vein, someone saying the actual word, quoting somebody as the same thing as someone saying, you're my N-word, or you're my guy because I'm saying this word and it doesn't mean anything because I'm Black. Like, to me, it's much more offensive for someone to say the word and pretend that they have a card or some kind of ability to say it when other people don't. I think the whole thing should be wiped out. We're teaching people this word generationally over and over again. We're making it cool and then saying, but you can't say it, and it's nonsense to me. But he knew what he was doing. I think that Neil Young had every right to say, I don't want to be on the same platform that's doing this. I think that he probably assumed that he'd be by himself doing it. I don't think that it was some left-wing conspiracy to get Joe Rogan. Clearly, he's had bad press, but so has a lot of people. I think Neil Young felt very fed up with what he saw on that podcast and decided that he would take whatever little power he had to exercise it, and everyone has that right. The fact that people jumped on board with that is also their right. And so I don't think that, this idea that, they were just out to get him is a viable position to take if you believe that people have the right to do whatever people have the right to do. And that's, if I own music, I don't want music on a platform that I disagree with. But I do think that we have to be very careful in this country of silence, of trying to keep ourselves away from information that either makes us uncomfortable or that doesn't fit into whatever ideology that we want to have, because we will become a nation of idiots. And I'm sort of like with you, Amber, I'm tired of the dance around language. I'm just speaking plainly here, but I just really feel like there's kind of an emergency happening right now, because people really are much more interested in the lie than they are the truth a lot of times. So I think that we don't want non-truths to be the prevalent way in this country, but we also want to be careful not to try and silence opinions versus information. Hopefully that was a little clear. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. We're going to go to Andrea next, and then after that, we do need to move on to the third topic, which is the Canadian truckers. So, Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Oh God, I have so many things going through my head now. I don't even know what to say. I guess basically, I think I do want to emphasize that I think if you're going to say something, whether it's a word or an idea that is offensive, just by the nature of what it is, I think people need to be restricted based on who they're offending. If I want to offend myself, then I'm free to do so. If I want to offend somebody else, I don't necessarily have that right. And I don't think it's, I don't see why people don't understand the concept of, and even actually bring up an argument of, well, this Black person said the N-word, so why can't I say the N-word? Actually, what I'd love to do is refer people to, there was this skit Key and Peele did about a little phone app you can have to determine whether or not you can say the N-word, and it a spoof, because it's just decency. It's being considerate, it's being decent, and it's being able to understand that not everybody has the same experience as you do, and not everybody, we're all different races, different nationalities, different everything, and it's a matter of not offending somebody else, knowing that you're offending them. Who cares who else says the N-word? You shouldn't say it. It's simple as that. Simple as that. But anyway, that's
Okay, thank you, Andrea.
Thomas, can I get a couple minutes on this? I didn't have a chance to speak on this subject.
just very briefly, yes, Marty, and then sorry, Kevin and Amber, we have another topic. So
Okay,
very
thanks.
quickly.
Thanks. So I just want to come to Rogan's defense. Amber referred to him as a comedian. Maybe he is. I've only watched him once on YouTube because he did a like a total of 6 hours of interviews on a movie. I'm putting the trailer in the chat screen. It's the Game Changers. It's about vegan super athletes, and he had people who are supportive of a vegan diet and people opposed to a vegan diet. And it was a very intelligent interview, 6 hours worth. There was a couple of different segments, and I thought it was fantastic. And that's the only thing I know about Joe Rogan. That's the only thing of him that I ever watched, but he certainly wasn't a comedian in that. He took the subjects very seriously and treated and asked tough questions and was respectful of his guests. I also want to mention that when it comes to PC with racial slurs, look, you know, I'm from New York. In New York, calling a Jew a kike is, you know, a real horrible thing. I've been called kike and cheap Jew and a million different things. And as far as I'm concerned, it's all okay. Not that I accept it. I'm just so opposed to PC that, you know, let people say what they want. I could ask them to please don't call me that. And if they still do, then I could just look for a company elsewhere, you know, or handle it a variety of ways. But I am not in favor of censorship in that regard. Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Okay, thanks, Marty. All right, so here's the final topic regarding the what's happening in Canada. And I will tee it up this way. Whenever you like go through the news cycle, nothing really interesting, at least from the US side, happens in Canada politically. I mean, you might hear about, you know, Jordan Peterson or some hockey team. I think this is really the first time in my lifetime where something big was going on in terms of its dominance in the news cycle, which are these protesters. And what's interesting is I'm wondering if some of the tensions in Canada are due to some of the spillover or the influence of the US. And I'm not going to go through a lot of the intro because I think most of you kind of know how we got here in terms of the protesters. But my understanding is that these truck drivers are essential workers. And I believe like 90%, so the vast majority of them are vaccinated. And there was a vaccine requirement. And these 10% of those who were probably not vaccinated were then protesting. And I think, best to my knowledge, I haven't followed the story in the last several days, but I think the protests have pretty much, stopped, or they were dismantled. So the question is, I guess the first question I want to ask everyone is, this type of civil disobedience, should that be permitted in our society? Let's start with that question first. And I know sometimes that question is kind of loaded because depending on what the ideology or the cause that they're protesting, that gets very, controversial. But let's go with Margaret and then Ellen.
So I have a couple of things. I know you were saying one of the questions was, is this bleed over from the United States? So I mentioned before, I listened to some podcasters out of Canada. Tensions were already getting very high, as far as I understand, at least in the greater Toronto region, in terms of a lot of crackdowns on unvaccinated, whether it was movement in and out of the country and stuff. So I think it was already fomenting before the trucker movement the trucker movement started. I'm not going to say that American tendency to protest did not necessarily influence it in some way, but I do think it does seem to be somewhat independent of us. That being said, more specifically to your point, should civil unrest be permitted? I absolutely 100%. We have in this country, we have the right to peaceful protest. And that does include, historically, we've seen it happen in many situations where that includes disruptions of service or, sit-ins or what have you. And as long as you're not, this is my opinion, but as long as you're not physically harming other people, I think you absolutely 100% have the right to express your opinion in a protest in pretty much almost whatever manner you wish to do, as long as it's nonviolent. And I do think in that sense, in many ways, we're kind of a model for many parts of the world. I think that a lot of people who come here, based on my friends who have come from international countries, Americans don't realize how much of a right we have to do this. And I think it's really important that we look at the way the media treats this very, very carefully, because I think that there is a lot of sentiment now where if you protest for the quote unquote wrong issues, you're really socially sanctioned in a lot of ways.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Before we get to Ellen, I'm just gonna respond to Margaret's comment. So, I mean, if there's any kind of spillover or influence from the US, I'm not implying it's a bad thing. It just, to my memory, Canada has always been kind of, I know this is a bit of a stereotype, but the good neighbor to the north. I believe their national motto is something like, peace, order, and good governance. And when you look at the protesters right now, they're chanting freedom. And that just sounds like something you would see at a more of like a, freedom-loving rallies here in the States. But then again, I remember watching a Simpsons episode a long time ago, where Homer Simpson called Canada America Junior. It was kind of like a, pejorative term, I guess. But perhaps there's some, cultural influence.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing. And I would like to add this. I honestly don't know if it's the most appropriate place, but I don't see another place where it fits in. I think a lot of these protests are because I think, again, at least in American culture, people are really shocked that people are protesting, say, vaccine mandates and stuff like that. And I think that historically in this country, we've seen this over and over again, where Americans just culturally, we don't respond well to the government telling us what to do. I think if the government had said, here's a vaccine, this is why you should take it, and left it at that, I think we would have a much higher vaccination rate. I really, truly do. I think a lot of people, I know people who they're extremely well educated. They're in the medical field and they're like, you know what? I'm standing on principle on this one. It's not that I disagree with the science. I disagree with the government telling me what to do. And I kind of, again, from some of the things I was hearing out of Canada, I feel like that was a little bit of the sentiment I was hearing too. It's like, okay, government overreach. And I think it's a buzzword right now, but I also think that for many people, this is a real fear.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Let's go to Ellen and then Andrew.
I just wanted to say that, well, one, I'm not sure that the truckers who were protesting were only the 10% who had not been vaccinated. There are vaccinated people who are against these mandates, myself included. And all the governments have seemed to ignore the fact that natural immunity, they've ignored natural immunity. It doesn't count. Even though there's been studies now out of Israel that people with natural immunity have stronger protection than the vaccinated. So the government has sowed the mistrust. Now, back to the idea of civil protests, as long as it's peaceful, and this was peaceful despite their prime minister trying to say otherwise, we absolutely have to have the ability to peacefully protest. What are the citizens supposed to do? Just lie down and take whatever the government says? I mean, if you think about this, the prime minister was putting in this rule that you now had to be vaccinated to be a trucker, when all last year, when there were no vaccines, these truckers were keeping the country rolling. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them have natural immunity. And I think the reaction of the prime minister was absolutely appalling. Not to go down and talk to them, to sit up there in his little house and call them Nazis, and they have unacceptable views, and then calling a state of national emergency. His behavior was horrible. And I don't know if you've heard, but in the last couple hours, he has now rescinded the national emergency in Canada. My suspicion is he got a call from the Queen herself. Apparently, she has to sign off on this. She has mild COVID right now, and I would not be surprised if that 96-year-old woman called him up and said, this is not the way the Commonwealth a Commonwealth country should be treating its own citizens. Knock it off. I wouldn't be surprised if he was getting his butt kicked politically for this, because his reaction was abominable. The way that he treated those truckers, abominable. And certainly we have to have the ability to protest peacefully. And otherwise, otherwise we might as well just all move to China.
Thanks, Ellen. One, I guess, kind of lack of flexibility or the rationale regarding the mandate was that it seems like truckers who spend most of their days by themselves in a truck, it's isolated. I don't really understand why they should be the ones that are targeted. I mean, I understand the priority of trying to get as many people vaccinated, but it just seems like this kind of rigid universal vaccination without even offering testing as an alternative just seemed like it was a bit of a politically tone-deaf move. That's what I think. And the other point that Ellen had brought up about just how independent Canada is, because on one hand, it seemed like they were getting a lot of pressure from the U.S. administration because they were clogging up the, some of the border roadways, and in light of this, supply chain shortage that we're having right now. So I think in some ways they got some pressure from the Biden administration to crack down on the protesters. But on the other hand, if what Ellen is saying is true, this administration also getting some blowback from the Commonwealth head of state. So it's pretty interesting dynamics going on there. Okay, let's go to Andrew and then Amber.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was eating something. Yeah, in terms of the whole trucking situation, I didn't see the point of it. Like, even if they didn't get vaccinated, they can still go into work. They just gotta make sure they get tested. But only like 10% of these truckers were like actually represented. And even the trucking union disagreed with the protesting. In terms of the situation with Trudeau and using his emergency powers, that was not a poggers moment for that, because it sort of gives like a pretty grim showcasing of how the government can use its powers in the wrong ways, especially in terms of freezing assets just out of nowhere. I would have much rather had them use the police and have them break up the protest, or have them like call in the military. At least people can see what's going on with the protest, and rather than just like mysterious like government shuts off like assets to these people. Excuse me. But in terms of that situation, I believe they were protesting for like 3 weeks, and like after those 3 weeks, like Canada was like completely like unfortunately taken down by its knees due to these protestings, which is sorry for Canada, people who are Canadian, which is not good for Canada. I was wondering, like, with the police, why did they like stall? But most of the police like were very unfortunately friendly with them from the videos I seen. So they didn't really even try to crack down on the protest at the first time. And I would have guessed if it was a Black Lives Matter protest, it would have been like very much the opposite direction with the police. But the only situation I had a bad part about the protest is the whole like freezing of assets, in which it's some kind of stupid policy with Canada in which they tried to bring in the military, but they couldn't because the city didn't want them to bring the military. So they had like nothing else to do. So they had to resort using the emergency powers, and then Trudeau just went Super Saiyan and said, okay, I'm just going to shut off these assets now. But thankfully, they revoked that. So that's cool on Canada. And I didn't even see the point why they were going to use the Emergencies Act, because it looked like the protest just died off once the police acted. But yeah, that was the only worrying part about the protest that got me shook, really.
All right, thanks, Andrew. And I do want to share a video clip. And this kind of shows this kind of creeping authoritarianism that Canada, the government of Canada, had implemented. And just take a look at this. It's about a 2-minute video, and it talks about the freezing of the financial assets and the payment service providers, and see what you think.
And good government. So let me repeat what I said on Monday. If your truck is being used in these protests, your corporate accounts will be frozen. The insurance on your vehicle will be suspended. The consequences are real, and they will bite. It is time for you to go home. And let me also be clear that we will have zero tolerance for the establishment of new blockades or occupations. We now have the tools to follow the money. We can see what is happening and what is being planned in real time. And we are absolutely determined that this must end.
Okay. So the key phrase there is we have the tools to follow the money. Does anyone have, I mean, is everyone okay with that kind of phraseology? I mean, that sounds like what the USA Patriot Act did. And essentially what it does is if you give any material support to some organization that the CIA determines to be terrorist, well, guess what? Your due process rights are completely eviscerated. And I think for those of us watching that video, you'd be pretty appalled by just the lack of due process and transparency. I'd like to get your reaction to that video snippet. So Amber, Olga, Sam, what do you guys think?
I want to say I'm not biased, but I think I am. I think that being able to protest is a right of everyone that they should have. You know, as much as we like to say America has a monopoly on it, I think France does it a lot better than we do, and more often on a number of things that I just roll my eyes at. But you know what? They have whole protesting classes in college. So yeah, they kind of take the flag on that one. But watching the protests in Canada it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me because one, I saw all these Canadian flags being waved, and that's not a Canadian thing. I go to Canada like every other year. This is actually the longest time I haven't been to Montreal, and I don't see flags everywhere. I'm not saying that Canadians aren't patriotic, but they don't show patriotism like we do. It's not on every bumper sticker, every like tagline in every ceremony. Their flag is just their flag. So I thought that was weird. I also thought it was weird that when the restrictions were actually being lifted, that is when the protests started. They were just starting to get kids back into school, and then from being virtual, and then the truckers messed it up and the kids had to go back to being virtual. So it was counterproductive on top of that. When we are talking about people holding up trade, especially during inflation, and we're having like a supply chain issues, and they held up trade between Canada and the United States, inflaming these issues even more and restricting traffic so people can get around and go to places where they needed to go, and honking their horns so people were all up at all times of night. That to me is destructive. You're now moving in domestic terrorist territory, because you're now going out of your way to hold these two countries at a standstill, when your issue makes no sense because 90% of truckers in Canada are vaccinated. So we're talking about a really, really small percent of a really small percent of that. So for you to hold the majority, hostage because you can't, get a vaccine is bonkers and ridiculous. Now I've heard rumors, well, not rumors. I saw an actual news show showing that I just can't remember which state these people were in, of American truckers who want to do the same thing here, want to do a drive from wherever they are to Washington, D.C. and hold things up. And when the reporter asked, hey, why would, what would you say to the people whose lives you're going to disrupt, who can't get their food, the ambulances can't get to them in time, and the police officers can't get to, crimes in time. They said, well, they didn't care about us, so we don't care about them. Yeah, domestic terrorist territory. I'm sorry. I don't know how many times we have to go through this. Most people don't even know what's in their own cereal, but you want to tell me that, oh, I don't want to put a vaccine in my body. Really? Have you done research? It's been like over a year now. Really, you just haven't found the research that makes it make sense for you. But you can't tell me anything that you put in your body today. Nothing, whether it's food, medication, vitamins, even what you wear on your skin. You can't tell me what's in any of those things. But you're worried about a vaccine that has at least 20 years of data research that was actually used beforehand to make these vaccines. But if you had to actually research, you would have known that. So no, I think there's a line. I think there's a line between protest and obstructionism. And if you're in the obstructionism territory, you are too close to domestic terrorists to me. I'm sorry.
Okay, point well taken, Amber. I would just say again, your point is certainly well noted, but I would caution against invoking the term domestic terrorist, because to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there was any violence from these
They did
protesters.
report violence they would go into, there was, I think, an incident where they went into a homeless shelter and they actually fought people for the food that was in there, which Trudeau was very, I think that's when he first said, okay, now we need to get more cops on this because now you're being disruptive, you're going into offices and harassing people. But the homeless shelter incident was definitely a violent incident that, no one died, but it's still violence. It wasn't, it was unnecessary.
Okay, understood. And if that was in fact perpetrated by these protesters, certainly violence should not be condoned. But what I've noticed with a lot of these movements, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, BLM, a lot of these protests, as it grows, it gets bigger, they let more people in, it gets co-opted. You have these opportunists and anarchists that come in, they infiltrate, and their job is to just cause chaos and just muddy the water. So I don't know exactly who these people were, but by and large, the vast majority of the reporting shows that these were non-violent protesters. Yes, was it inconvenient? Sure. But I think that's the purpose of protest. Again, whether if it's, marching across, the bridge during the civil rights protest, or even during the BLM protest when they marched over the Williamsburg Bridge in New York City. That's the purpose of the protest, is to make things inconvenient so that, the public could sense the grievance that people have. And the other point is, even if these protesters are a minority of the voters of Canada, I think those who are the vocal minority still deserve to be heard, don't you think? It shouldn't be just based on sheer majority. I think in an open society, whether it's a popular view or an unpopular view, everyone's voice should be heard, and they have the right to petition the government for redress. That's the whole purpose behind an open society. I don't think they should be shut out because they're only the 10% or so, or whatever the minority percentage that they represent. So
well, maybe they should take a knee at the next soccer game. Then. They can protest that way.
Okay. Although I'm not sure if truckers necessarily take the knee, but I understand your point there. Okay. I do want to get to some other members here. We're almost running out of time, so if you can keep your comments brief. Olga, Sam, and then Andrew.
Okay, hi, it's me, yes?
Yes.
No. Okay, hi. So I wanted to talk about something. I wanted to talk that probably right now all governments everywhere try to test new tools that they got during like last 10 years. So it's not like they really try to test these tools to look how they can suppress something undesirable. But after Amber talked, I would like to just tell one story. I personally know a woman who came in the United States, like 30 years ago when she was in her 30s. And she was very scientifically oriented. And she was still is very educated. And she was advised to have a flu shot. And she did, of course. And still then she has chronic pain. And she could not get anywhere with this information. Everywhere she got to, it's just coincidence. You see, a woman in her 30s was very healthy before that, and and probably if she had more money and she knew that in United States you should hire a lawyer and sue everyone, probably she could get somewhere, but she did not know about this. So she was a poor immigrant. So for almost 30 years, she tried to somehow go from doctor to doctor, but all medications and everything did not work. At last, she found some kind of natural treatment and became better, not absolutely cured, but better. Of course, she did not do, right now, she did not have a vaccination right now because she could not get even to the thought that she will have again this pain that she had in the beginning. Of course, she did not. So she got COVID. She got better without any special treatment. And of course, she is not going to have vaccination. So we don't know anything about these 10% of these people. We don't know anything about their relations. Maybe they had something like this in their life with their relatives or with themselves. We don't know anything, so we cannot judge them and put them in terrorist category. We just don't know. It's the same as with an word. When we name them terrorists, we insult people without knowing their circumstances. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, thanks, Olga. Let's move on to Sam and then Andrew.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I have a lot to say because I'm Canadian. I'm actually 2 hours from the epicenter, being in Montreal. So there are a lot of I guess a lot of really a lot of misconceptions about this. First of all, in terms of real disruption, this protest was not disruptive. It was someone calculated. We had a lot of protests from First Nation activists 2 years ago before COVID, where they blocked the railways and highways, and someone calculated that somewhere around 80 times more freight was traffic was suspended versus this. They really they're in Ottawa, they're not blocking anything except the downtown core. You could walk to your off work, or you could even go around. So basically, the problem is not that they were really disruptive, in terms of disrupting the economy, but they were very effective. It was an incredibly effective protest because the optics were clearly you had sort of like a 3-week long party, like a 3-week long 4th of July equivalent in Ottawa, and it was sort of like it's a family event, and it's also like people up here, like this was the coldest stretch of winter, and we've had a pretty cold stretch. It's about -20 Celsius. It's about maybe 10 below Fahrenheit. So these people are actually sort of really going through a lot of hardship in that protest, and they're going through a lot of hardship economically as well, because when you have a rig, those things cost $200,000, and they pay mortgage on them. They have to sort of really taking time off work is a big personal sacrifice. So basically, these people suffered a lot economically in the last 2 years, and they felt, rightfully so, that their sort of economic hardship was not, taken into account by the government, and so, and here is the ultimate hypocrisy, that we had a really hard lockdown and incredible sort of costs in terms of economic hardship, like the debt. Trudeau sort of run up the debt by $650 billion, which is somewhere around 40% of the GDP. So he more than doubled the national debt. And this is going to be an incredible economic hardship. And in comparison, these sort of truckers camping in Ottawa for a few weeks is nothing. It's infinite. The economic damage is infinitesimal compared to the damage from the policies, hard lockdown policies. The other point is that someone said that the unions are sort of yellow, those truckers are independent truckers. There's about 30% of the industry, and that's a constantly shrinking percentage because their profession is becoming harder and harder due to regulations and the sort of the big players kind of wanting to cut. They want to sort of like, it's sort of like the equivalent of BlackRock buying up the housing stock in order to turn homeowners into renters. It's exactly the same dynamic. So you have the truck drivers union are sort of lined up with the corporate arm of the trucking industry, and these people sort of like have been experiencing a lot of economic hardship in terms of rising gas costs and other sort of barriers to having to pay like permits, and thus now they're being sort of denied like the right to practice their profession. And the other points that even though a lot 90% includes basically people who have like a one vaccine, 2 vaccine, and we were about to pass to the booster was going to be required, and at that point the percentage of vaccinated of sort of people with the valid vaccine passport was going to drop precipitously, like somewhere closer to 50%, because people, a lot of people have had Omicron, and people didn't see really the same utility for the vaccine that they saw that was presented to them last maybe a year ago. So yes, those are all important elements. The other element is that there was no protest violence. The story about the homelessness is really ridiculous, because there was a lot of sort of free food in Ottawa. Never in the history of Ottawa have homeless people been as better fed in the last 3 weeks, because there were a lot of kiosks sort of offering free food. They had soup, pizza, they had like a lot of things, and burgers, whatever. Like they sort of like a lot of people came in and spontaneously fed the truckers, and there was sort of really a kind of spirit that was kind of similar to the Occupy Wall Street in the early days. And the violence that was done there was inflicted by the police. The police stomped. They sent their horses. They stomped on a 67-year-old woman in a that was part of the protest, and she was like in a Lark scooter, like she was a handicapped woman. They stomped on her with a riot police horse. Those are big beasts, and she's still in the hospital trying to recover. And the protests also, like when you hear like sort of I guess Amber talked about protests in France, those are incredibly violent protests in which more than a dozen protesters were killed, and 30 protesters were shot in the eye and lost eyesight, and sort of a lot of people, and like just an incredible amount of violence that was unseen there, not even in May 68 in Paris, and those things are not reported. And the kind of sort of like the protest was suppressed because of the threats, the economic threats, the to the truckers and to and the violence. Like a lot of protests were really roughed up pretty harshly, and those were kind of used as an example. And it's kind of insidious where you can see those protests in the alternative media, but they're not shown on the mainstream media. So the public at large is kind of kept kind of shielded from the kind of violence that's been going on there. And yeah, the police did not crack down first because they were, it was like there were a lot of families, like there was no real violence. Those people, they were like they kind of parked in the middle of the street and they made a lot of noise. This is like the only type of violence, and in a way, like that's why like the police did not want to crack skulls, and so they fired the Ottawa police chief, and they sent in someone, and they had like a lot of police forces shipped in from other parts of the country because the local police did not want to like implement the kind of state violence and repress the protest there.
Okay,
yeah.
thanks, Dan. Yeah,
Sure.
thanks for your firsthand, I guess, observations and reporting. One of the good things about this group is we have members joining from all different parts of the country and the world. So your insights are greatly appreciated. Here's the question, though, Sam, and maybe you may or may not know the answer. Do you think these protests, do you think the vaccine mandate was kind of like the final straw that broke the camel's back? Do you think it was a accumulation of economic anxieties, restrictions, and the mask mandate was like the final thing where they said enough is enough, and that's what kind of gave momentum to the protesters? Or do you think it's something else?
I think, there is a bit of a final straw dynamic, but it wasn't sort of like a one straw. It was a big, like last bale of straw because people, were sort of, the mandate was really extreme, and actually the protest was very successful. Right afterward, basically the head of the opposition, the conservative opposition, who wasn't, particularly, he was kind of lined up with Trudeau's, was sort of evicted. There was a kind of a non-confidence vote. So now they're going to have the opposition is going to be more lined up with them, and 4 provinces changed their sort of came out like sort of, it kind of compelled 4 provinces to repeal a lot of their kind of strong mandate policies.
Yeah, thanks. Because I've seen some interviews, and again, I'm not saying these interviews are representative of all the protesters, but there were protesters who were non-truck drivers. So I saw fishermen, I saw farmers, I saw beekeepers, and they all came to protest because I think the underlying kind of the undercurrent is this economic anxiety. So if it weren't for those who are concerned about loss of jobs, unemployment, economic anxieties, I don't think the protests would have had the momentum. Here's a point that I do want to make, though, because we always view these protests from the prism of partisan politics in the US. And here in the US, we're used to those who are left-leaning, who tends to be more economic populist and who are in favor of protecting workers' rights. It seems like that's not the case in Canada, because if you are more on the side of economic populism, you would certainly protect the interests of these workers, whether it's truck drivers, farmers, etc. But it seems like we're seeing just the opposite. We're seeing a very harsh authoritarian crackdown from a liberal government, which to me, I find that to be shocking. The other thing is, there's really no I guess the left tends to be more like pro-labor, so they would want to have like certain standards and regulations that would protect the labor standards. But it seems like there's really not much of a concern there in terms of the left in Canada. So what do you think about that, Sam?
I think it's not just a Canadian feature. It's sort of like ever since Tony Blair was kind of the first figure, labor leader that sort of where you had a shift in the left, sort of becoming more sort of like a kind of a more like concern with societal issues than economic issues and traditional labor issues. So that sort of that kind of characteristic is not specific to Canada, but yes, the nowadays, I mean, the kind of like the populist, we've seen that in the United States with Trump. Like Trump won because he got the Rust Belt voters who were traditionally, labor Democrats. So you had kind of, and you also had parts in Texas, for example, in Houston, the high-end neighborhoods kind of voted Democrat, which was kind of new to them. So you have a shift with the kind of urban classes, going sort of more left, and the labor and rural sort of classes going more right. And part of it is because the economic hardships, sort of haven't been, the economic situation has been felt very differently, while the sort of new technology, banking, real estate, and other sort of urban areas are doing okay, or pretty well even. A lot of other areas, related with the industry, and other sort of like rural regions haven't been doing well. So that's the shift we see.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I have 5 minutes left, so let's try to get through other members. So Andrew, Marty, Margaret, then Ellen. Andrew, go ahead.
All right. I in terms of myself, I do not agree that this whole situation with like the truckers or the freedom convoy is like this workers' rights dispute. If it sounds like to me that most of these people are just like business owners and they have the time and day to just be out there. In terms of what they've been doing, they've been blocking the Ambassador Bridge, which is like the key asset point of like Canadian truckers to drive by, and them forming this blockade doesn't really help other truckers out, if they were going to protest, at least like not be a pain and just like literally block the artery of Canada. But I guess this will be more in terms of fault with Canada themselves, because this is yet again, this is like Canada's own policy making, which doesn't make sense, in which they were literally like, it took us a 9/11 to like implement like the Patriot Act and all that stuff, which is like really shitty. But it's like, this is just like 10% of like a small group of like truckers who just like wasn't taken seriously by the police, and they were there for like 3 weeks. I mean, the economic damage was pretty great in terms of how much money they lost, but in terms of, I mean, I don't know what to say in terms of this protest. Sounds like it's mostly, it is mostly a far right protest, especially with the leader saying that, these people, they're trying to lower down the white population or some crap like that, while I was listening to him on on YouTube posting his video. So I don't think that these truckers were there for good faith labor rights.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Marty?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. First, Thomas, I want to thank you for your making the distinction between terrorism and violence. It's very apropos. Terrorism is killing people with the intention of political gain, and usually people who are not really involved, usually civilians, that kind of thing. Whereas violence is simply, overturning police cars, burning buildings, and that kind of crazy stuff. I also wanted to mention that, and I mentioned this before, during the 60s, and early 70s, I was very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I've been tear gassed many times and pepper sprayed. I've been arrested without charges, and eventually released because there had been no charges. But nevertheless, I was detained for 3 days, and my point is, I think the government had a right to do all that. We were blocking traffic. we were not violent. We did not destroy a thing. We didn't even litter, but we were blocking traffic, and the city has to exist. And so of course they were right to tear gas us. I felt it at that time, and I think it now. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marty. Let's go to Margaret, and then we'll wrap it up with Ellen.
Thanks, Thomas. I just wanted to address the comments that were made. That there were two comments made that kind of stood out to me. One was comparing the actions of the truckers to domestic terrorism, and the other was the comment about not knowing what's going into your body. For me, that's not the point. It doesn't matter whether I know what's going into my body or not. My question is, where do we draw the line? Where does the government stop telling us what to do with our bodies? If you support Roe versus Wade, you should equally support people having the choice to get vaccinated. I'm sure that the British thought that it was domestic terrorism when we, threw the tea into the harbor and started off the Revolutionary War. And I think that at a certain point, we have to sort of stand up for our rights and say, hey, we're not going to stand for this because you are overreaching. And I think that's where the truckers get their ideology from. And I think that's where American truckers who are considering this, or other people who are protesting, consider this. And if you're asking me whether I think that it's valuable, I said this before, I think that it is absolutely valuable. Again, it doesn't matter to me whether I know what's in the vaccine or not, whether I'm vaccinated or not. That does not mean that I support the government telling us what to do with our bodies. And I think it's absolutely a valid point to tell the government they need to back off. Because again, where do we draw the line? If we tell the government, oh, okay, it's okay for you to tell us to do this, what's the next thing they're going to tell us to do? And then to the point of, people point to saying, oh, what about the science? What about this? What about that? We already know how inoculation works. We already know. We've known since the Middle Ages how inoculation works. Exposure creates immunity. That's how it works. The original vaccines, the smallpox vaccine was discovered because milkmaids did not get smallpox because they'd already had cowpox. So therefore, they made the connection like, oh, getting a certain level of exposure protects you later on. Everybody's like, oh, you have to get vaccinated. Well, people who are a lot younger than me probably don't know this, but I had chickenpox. I got vaccinated from chickenpox the old-fashioned way. I don't think that we have to run and get a vaccine for everything that's out there. And I think that people who've chosen not to are just as valid in their opinion as the people who've chosen to do so. And I think we have to keep that in mind before we start kind of saying, oh, well, they're blocking this or they're making it uncomfortable for that. And, that's their right. They're doing what they're supposed to do as long as they're not violent. I don't see a problem with it, but maybe that's me.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. And then we'll go to Ellen.
I think you just heard from Margaret.
Yes, Ellen, you're next.
Oh, okay. I agree with everything that Margaret just said. I also think that if this disease was as deadly as smallpox or measles, the government wouldn't have to be trying to force this down people's throats. They would willingly go out and get vaccinated. I think we have enough information now that we know who's at the highest risk of getting COVID. We also now know that if you caught COVID and recovered, thanks to studies from Israel, your natural immunity can protect you. Despite the fact that our government, Canadian government, doesn't want to recognize that. And I do think this was people basically saying enough is enough. And as for causing any kind of economic disruption, I'm really sorry, but the leader of Canada should have made an effort to go down and talk to the truckers. He should have tried to resolve the situation in a pleasant way. Instead, he immediately went on the attack. They have unacceptable views. They're not listening to me. I mean, he was like a tyrant from the get-go. And then he puts in this Emergency Powers Act, which was just horrible. And so frankly, I blame Justin Trudeau for the entire debacle. And I think the truckers won in public opinion. And I have a funny feeling the Queen said enough is enough, because here in Britain, they've dropped all these COVID mandates. And I just think they said enough is enough. We don't want a Commonwealth country on television beating up its own citizens. So I'm glad that the truckers won.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. I guess I was trying to think of like a common thread between the three topics that we covered tonight. And I think there is one, which is in a free society, you're always going to be confronted with some uncomfortable thought or some inconvenience or some person who might say certain things that might offend you. But that's just the reality of living in a free society. And I think that's really the thread between the three topics that we talked about tonight. Just going back to the trucker protest, what's interesting about this story is that you find hypocrisies. I hate to say due to both sides, but it's so true. Whether if it's Rand Paul urging truckers to rally for Super Bowl, or whether if it's the left-leaning government cracking down with a very severely authoritarian kind of unprecedented invocation of a semi-martial law, it's very troubling because you ask yourself, do you think Rand Paul would have allowed, let's say, a group of teachers, school teachers who are also essential workers, form a convoy and disrupt the Super Bowl? Probably not. Do you think the left would be okay if some conservative government came in Canada and now invoked the same martial law to now go after some left-leaning group, whether if it's environmental group or social justice reform group, to freeze their financial assets? Well, I don't think the left would be very, very happy. And it's be careful what you wish for, because you might agree with the government's doing now because it fits nicely within your ideological box. But in the future, once you set that precedence, that genie is out of the box. Once you relinquish that power to the government, there has been no precedence in the past where the government says, it's time for us to relinquish the powers that you entrusted with us. Now we're going to curtail the scope of government. That just never happened. So it's one of those instances where you want to be careful what you wish for. And I think kind of the telltale sign of what happened in Canada is that this could be a dry run for what could happen in the US now. I think there is like a truck convoy that's heading to the DC right in time for the State of the Union. So we'll see what happens. But again, in a free society, you have to be inconvenienced by even those views that you find to be objectionable. As long as it's peaceful, as long as it's nonviolent, I think they have every right, just as other groups have the right to do. So with that being said, I'm out of time. It's been a fascinating 3-hour conversation. I wish we could have talked for another 3 hours, but we're just simply out of time. So I will see you guys next time. Take care. Good night. Be safe.
Thanks, Tom. Well said.
Thank you, Thomas.